Before pyramids pierced the sky, before Maya scribes inked their glyphs, the jungle of southern Mexico was already whispering. Not the polite kind of whisper, more like the heavy, wet breathing of a world half awake. Mist slid through mangroves. Cicadas screeched with a devotion that felt religious. And between the modern states of Veracruz and Tabasco, three wide rivers began an ancient conversation that would one day give birth to the first civilization of the Americas. Picture it, the Coatzacoalcos, the Tonalá, and the Grijalva, winding through lowland plains no higher than 50 meters above the sea. Their waters glittered under a sun that refused to set, quietly pooling into lagoons, cutting new channels, each season flooding everything in sight, then retreating to leave behind black, fertile mud, nature's own renewal plan. It wasn't a gentle landscape. It was alive, unstable, almost impatient. Yet out of that chaos came order. The people who wandered here 10 or 12,000 years ago were foragers, hunters of deer and peccary fishers, who could read a river's mood by the way herons stood in the shallows. They carried fire on sticks and gods in their pockets, if we believe the carved stones they left behind. Over centuries, they learned that the land's temper, its floods and droughts, could be coaxed rather than feared. When the waters withdrew each year, they sowed maize and squash in the damp earth and watched it burst upward with astonishing gratitude. Where other regions fought thin soil and stone, this one rewarded effort with abundance. By 1500 BC, tiny hamlets of pole and thatch houses began dotting the natural levees above the floodplains. Chickens clucked in reed pens, children splashed in canals alive with turtles, and smoke curled lazily through the treetops. The air smelled of wet earth river fish and new beginnings. From the outside, it still looked like wilderness, but underneath, human intention was taking root. Everywhere, the landscape offered tools for ambition. Volcanic ash from the distant Tuxtla Mountains enriched the alluvial soils, turning them into fields so generous they barely rested. Rain fell in warm sheets, more than 200 millimeters each year. Temperature hovered between 26 and 28 degrees Celsius, endless summer. To modern ears, it sounds like paradise, but imagine living without bug spray or drainage every night, an orchestra of frogs every morning, a new mosquito rebellion. Yet even discomfort can be a teacher. The people learned to elevate their homes, to pile earth into protective mounds, to carve channels that guided the water instead of letting it rule them. Slowly, the rhythms of flood and growth began to dictate something greater than survival, a calendar. Seasons meant harvests. Harvests meant gatherings. Gatherings meant stories. Myths, to explain why the maize sprouted after thunder, or why the jaguar's roar echoed in storms. Religion didn't yet have temples, but it already had an audience. Beneath the same stars, we know today, villagers offered maize cakes and shells to invisible forces dwelling in the rivers. In a place where water could both give and destroy life overnight, the idea of gods felt less like imagination and more like observation. Trade, too, stirred awake. Travelers followed waterways lined with palms, paddling dugout canoes piled high with obsidian blades, dried chilies, and green feathers from faraway hills. Each meeting of strangers brought new words, new colors, new ideas about how to shape clay or Polish stone. Out of this slow-motion mingling, the spark of identity ignited the sense of being something more than a cluster of huts. They were becoming a people. Archaeologists would later name them the Olmec, though they never called themselves that. The term simply means rubber people in Nahuatl, a label borrowed from later Aztecs, who noticed that this region produced the bouncing sap used in the ritual ball game. But long before rubber balls, there were hands shaping clay figurines of pregnant women, and tiny jaguars, hinting that these first artisans already felt the pulse of creativity and perhaps vanity. Someone somewhere decided a pot wasn't just for cooking, but for beauty. That single thought separates a civilization from a camp. If you stood on a ridge above the wetlands around 1400 BC, you might have seen smoke from dozens of hearths rising into the evening haze. Frogs croaked. Distant thunder rolled over the gulf. Between the rivers, faint drumming carried on humid air. A new rhythm had joined the forest, the heartbeat of organized life. The transformation didn't come with war chariots or iron blades, just with patience, mud, and maize. These people would soon learn to sculpt the land itself into terraces, to raise temples from packed earth, to command hundreds of workers in choreographed labor. But in this first moment, as stars flickered over the mirror-flat lagoons, none of that grandeur existed yet. Only the promise did the quiet knowledge that the rivers dreaming beneath the moon could be persuaded to dream in human shapes. And so, in the cradle of humidity and thunder, the story of the Olmecs began, not as legend, but as geography, deciding it was tired of being wild. The jungle exhaled, the rivers turned in their sleep, and humanity, for the first time in the Americas, started to build a world meant to last. Part 2. From huts to horizon. Birth of villages. The rivers had spoken, and people listened. By the middle of the second millennium BC, the tropical lowlands of Veracruz and Tabasco were no longer just hunting grounds, they were beginning to hum with permanence. The rhythm of daily life thickened. Smoke from hearths rose in predictable columns. Children no longer wandered after game, but tended plots of maize that swayed like yellow-green tides. The wilderness had met its match, not in conquest, but in slow, domestic persuasion. Imagine standing at dawn, near one of those early settlements. Mist clings to the reeds like wet silk, the air buzzing with unseen insects. On a raised earthen mound, a family's house leans against the horizon walls, woven from palm fronds, roof of thatched doorway, facing the east, where the sun will soon flare gold. A thin spiral of smoke curls from a clay hearth. Inside, a woman grinds maize on a stone matat, rhythmic as breathing. The sound grind scrape lift sets the tempo of civilization itself. Each household was a tiny republic of effort. Men fished with woven nets along the flooded banks, their canoes gliding through mirror, still water, broken only by the flash of heron wings. Children gathered wild fruits. Dogs barked at passing shadows, and everywhere the scent of cooking mingled with the earthy sweetness of wet soil. Around these houses stretched narrow footpaths, connecting families, then clusters of families, until the first villages appeared, a dozen homes, then 20, then 50. The jungle began to make room for neighborhoods. Flooding shaped everything. Each year, the rivers swelled impatient and generous, smothering the lowlands beneath brown water. When they receded, they left thick, nutrient-rich sediment soil, so fertile it glowed black in the sunlight. Early farmers learned to anticipate this rhythm, planting as soon as the water withdrew, and harvesting before the next deluge. In time, they began reshaping the land itself, piling up earth to form levees, digging channels to drain excess water, turning wetlands into patchwork gardens. These proto-engineers discovered that mud, when respected, could become architecture. And with architecture came organization. Someone had to decide where the mounds should be built, when to dig the ditches, how to share the harvest. Out of practicality was born leadership, a council of elders perhaps, or a single persuasive voice whose words carried through the mist. It wasn't monarchy yet, but the first tremor of hierarchy. Food surplus meant time for artisans to perfect pottery, for storytellers to embellish myths, for ambitious minds to imagine things larger than a village. Archaeologists have found the fingerprints of those ambitions baked into clay. The earliest Olmec pottery, simple round-bodied jars, shows experimentation in firing temperature, and clay mixture. Then almost suddenly, the designs bloom. Black vessels with white rims, burnished surfaces, polished by hand, incised lines, forming geometric motifs. Someone had decided that the practical deserved the beautiful. Small figurines appear too, mothers holding infants, animals mid-roar, and occasionally faces with almond eyes and downturned mouths. Early echoes of the supernatural jaguar that would later stalk their religion. In those figurines, art begins to dream of gods. Stonework followed clay. Along the riverbanks, villagers discovered pebbles, harder than others, perfect for polishing and shaping. They began trading for better stone obsidian from distant highlands, jade from Guatemala's Motagua Valley basalt from the Tuxtla Mountains. To modern eyes, these trade networks look astonishingly sophisticated. To the Olmecs, it probably felt like necessity. You couldn't build prestige or a proper blade without the right stone. So canoes loaded with green jade and glossy obsidian began to appear at the docks of humble villages. Each arrival carried more than goods. It carried gossip news and the subtle realization that their world was larger than the horizon. With trade came comparison. Some families had more jade beads than others. Some houses stood taller on their mounds. Wealth, once irrelevant, began to whisper of status. The first social stratification formed not through cruelty, but through clay and stone, a hierarchy measured in craftsmanship. One day, you're the best potter in the village. The next, you're the potter who makes offerings for the gods and eats from finer bowls. Religion, too, was crystallizing. The villagers had long sensed power in the rivers and mountains, the storm that fed and drowned them, the jaguar that vanished into shadow, the maize that died and resurrected each year. Now they began formalizing those forces into something like ritual. Altars of packed clay rose beside the water, adorned with shells, fish bones, and small figurines buried as offerings. Fires burned at dawn, and dusk their smoke curling skyward like speech. Somewhere in those early chants, the idea of divine kingship stirred a human channel between people and gods. At night, the villages glowed faintly with hearthlight. Elders told stories that stretched back further than memory, explaining how the world was born from darkness, how the rivers were once serpents, how the first maize sprouted from a god's spilled blood. Around those fires, children stared wide-eyed at the jungle that pressed in on every side, equal parts threat and promise. Every rustle of leaves could be the jaguar god watching every crack of thunder his approval. Myth gave meaning to the unknown, and meaning made courage possible. As the generations passed, the villages multiplied like stars reflected in water. Along the Coatzacoalcos and its tributaries, dozens of communities formed a living necklace of light, each connected by trade marriage and shared ritual calendars. Some specialized in pottery, others in stone tools or woven textiles. The rhythm of exchange pulsed steadily, turning isolated hamlets into a cultural ecosystem. It's easy from our modern distance to underestimate this quiet revolution. There were no written decrees, no armies on the march, only farmers, builders, potters, and priests slowly weaving complexity into their daily routines. Civilization rarely begins with a bang. More often, it hums like a beehive until the world realizes it's listening to something new. By around 1400 BC, one settlement began to outshine the rest: San Lorenzo. It sat on a natural plateau above the floodplain, a rare patch of high ground surrounded by fertile fields and navigable waterways. The choice of location was almost poetic, safe from floods, yet close to the rivers that had birthed everything. From this vantage, one could look out and see the veins of the land glistening in the sunlight, carrying fish people and dreams. Families migrated there, bringing their crafts and hopes. The mound builders became architects. The potters became designers of prestige. The elders became administrators. A city was gestating, and it carried the DNA of every hut that had ever stood in the wetlands. Soon, it would command hundreds of workers, reshape entire hills, and send colossal stones rolling across jungles. But for now, San Lorenzo was only a rumor, a village that refused to stay small. The wetlands had given generously, and humanity learned the rhythm of its moods. But to live with the rivers was to court both blessing and disaster. One season of rain too long, and the maize drowned. One drought too harsh, and the fish vanished from the channels. So, the early Olmec people, still centuries before anyone would call them, that set out to tame the breathing earth beneath their feet. Not with arrogance, but with an engineer's patience, the kind born from living face to face with flood and famine. At first, their experiments looked almost accidental. An extra shovel of mud here, a shallow trench there. But generation by generation, the people learned. They built narrow ridges, each only a few meters wide, separated by watery ditches, proto-chinampas, the raised fields that would one day astonish later Mesoamerican civilizations. These ridges held firm even when the floodwaters returned. The ditches, instead of drowning the crops, became protective moats, full of fish turtles and nutrient-rich silt. A field became a pond, became a harvest. Nature was no longer enemy or mystery, it was partner. Archaeologists later found pollen trapped in those ancient soils, maize beans, squash chili peppers, a whole diet, and a whole social order written in microscopic dust. The yields were impressive. More food meant more people. More people meant more coordination. Coordination meant politics, whether anyone wanted it or not. The farmer needed the canal digger. The canal digger needed the tool maker, and all of them needed someone to say when planting season began. Out of the rhythm of mud and maize came hierarchy slow as silt, but just as unstoppable. Imagine the scene. Early morning mist still clings to the fields as dozens of villagers stand ankle-deep in water, pushing wooden poles into the mud, singing in time with their labor. Along the edges, women carry baskets of seedlings, their feet leaving soft impressions in the damp earth. At the center stands a figure, maybe a chief, maybe just the best organizer calling instructions with the authority of experience. This is what civilization looks like at its birth-organized mud. The raised fields, known in later centuries as camelones, weren't merely practical. They represented a philosophy that chaos could be sculpted, that water could obey. And because they worked, people began to believe in the minds that designed them. The first engineers became the first elites. They knew how to read soil measure slope, predict floods. To the average farmer, that knowledge felt like magic. Somewhere in the haze between hydrology and prayer, the idea of sacred leadership sprouted roots. Permanent agriculture demanded permanent structures. Villages once rebuilt, after every flood now grew bold enough to stay put. They raised earthen platforms high above the plains, compacting layer after layer of clay sand and ash until the foundations hardened like stone. On these elevated plateaus, they built houses bigger, sturdier, more ambitious than before. Wooden posts stood in symmetry. Walls were plastered with lime and painted with ochre and charcoal. The humblest hut was giving way to the first architecture. With permanence came specialization. Not everyone needed to farm anymore. Some shaped pottery, their fingers memorizing the feel of wet clay. Others knapped obsidian coaxing blades so sharp they could split a hair. Children watched and learned trades their grandparents could not have imagined. Labor diversified, and with it, identity. You were no longer just a villager. You were a potter, a carver, a keeper of the calendar. Civilization had begun to speak in job titles. The canals themselves became veins of communication. Canoes drifted between settlements carrying maize, fish gossip, and gods. From the highlands came obsidian and basalt. From the lowlands, rubber and cacao. Jade glimmered like condensed rain in the hands of traders who must have looked like magicians, their wares glinting green beneath the tropical sun. The rivers, once boundaries, were now highways. The Olmec world was expanding not through conquest, but through connection. And somewhere along those routes, ideas traveled too. The notion that the world had order, that it followed cycles like the floods and the maize plant grow, die return, became the quiet backbone of religion. The farmers who watched the moon's reflection ripple in their canals started wondering whether the same cycles governed the heavens. They began marking days by the waxing of the moon, by the shadow lengths of midday, by the songs of returning birds. Without realizing it, they were inventing timekeeping. At dusk, as fireflies stitched gold patterns above the wetlands, villagers would gather near the water's edge. They built low platforms and burned incense made from pine resin and herbs. The smoke curled upward, mixing with the scent of wet earth. Elders spoke of the spirits living beneath the rivers of the jaguar, whose roar commanded the rain. They placed figurines into the mud, half human, half beast, and whispered for balance, for harvest, for forgiveness. These rituals were part engineering manual, part theology. The gods would help, but only if you managed your canals correctly. Meanwhile, the society's structure was thickening like clay under heat. The surplus harvest allowed a few individuals to live not by farming, but by directing others, supervising labor, storing grain, conducting ceremonies. The first signs of inequality appeared subtle but unmistakable. Finer pottery in one household imported obsidian blades, in another burial offerings, hinting that some lives carried greater weight. Yet for now, these differences did not divide, they stabilized. A stratified society is fragile only when its surplus fails. For the moment, the rivers were generous, and so were the gods. The people had found a delicate equilibrium. Their villages stood like green islands, amid silver water, the raised fields extending in perfect geometry. At sunset, the scene must have looked like an enormous mirror, reflecting the sky clouds above canals, below everything trembling with color. A visitor from a harsher land might have thought these people had conquered paradise. But the Olmecs knew better. Paradise had moods, and moods required management. Still, they dreamed bigger. The builders who once raised simple mounds began to imagine terraces large enough for gatherings, for rituals, maybe even for rule. Clay figurines of seated figures appeared cross-legged, serene, possibly leaders or ancestors. The idea of ancestry itself began to crystallize. If the rivers had memory, so did people. The dead mattered. Graves grew deeper. Offerings grew richer. The living wanted to impress the future. By 1400 BC, their small, scattered settlements were beginning to link into something resembling a region, a constellation of communities sharing art gods and technologies. And somewhere among them, a few leaders began to look at the land differently. They didn't just see fields and rivers. They saw potential for monumentality, for a place that could embody their world's balance between water and earth power and piety. They dreamed of a center, a capital of clay and spirit. That dream had a name waiting for it, San Lorenzo. But before it rose, the land itself had to agree. The rivers would need convincing. The earth coaxed the people united. Civilization had its tools, now mud, muscle, maze, and meaning. What it lacked was form. In the coming centuries, they would carve that form into hills, drag stones heavier than elephants across jungle terrain, and teach the world that permanence could be sculpted from impermanence itself. The first blueprint had already been drawn, not on parchment, but in the grid of fields and canals shining beneath the sun. At first glance, the hill hardly looked like destiny. It was a long rise above the Coatzacoalcos River, a modest plateau of clay and gravel, the kind of place early travelers might have climbed just to catch a dry breeze. But to the eyes of the people who would become the Olmecs, that hill was a promise. It offered the one thing the floodplain could not hide: a view of the horizon, a throne above the restless water. They began to settle it around 1400 BC, piling their houses on wooden stilts and compacted soil, the smell of clay thick in the humid air. The rivers murmured below, as if reluctant to let them go. The first generation built cautiously small dwellings on the ridge granaries' shrines. The next built boldly. They reshaped the very land, hauling earth basket by basket, until the hill was no longer a hill, but a platform, artificial, immense, deliberate. The world's first urban experiment in the Americas had begun. Imagine the scene under a morning haze. Hundreds of workers, men, women, and children, climb the slope, carrying wicker baskets of damp soil, each footstep squelching in the mud. The air is heavy with sweat and birdsong. Overseers mark the rhythm with chants, their voices echoing across the valley. The plateau grows by the day, layer upon layer of red and brown clay, compacted into terraces. By the time the rains return, the hill has grown taller, stronger, and more symmetrical. Humanity has reshaped geology. Archaeologists estimate that nearly 200,000 cubic meters of fill dirt were moved to create the final platform, an engineering feat rivaling the pyramids of Egypt, though built without metal tools or beasts of burden. The result was San Lorenzo, Tenochtitlan, the beating heart of early Olmec civilization. At its peak, around 1200 BC, it sprawled across 700 hectares, crowned with plazas, stepped terraces, and ceremonial courts. To those who approached by canoe, gliding up the river's reflective surface, the city must have looked like a man-made mountain, rising from the swamp, a mirror of the sacred hills that ringed the horizon. From atop the platform, the rulers could see everything: the silver coils of the river, the smoky lines of distant villages, the green quilt of cultivated fields stretching to the sea. Here, for the first time in the Americas, power gained altitude. The Olmecs didn't just build up, they built meaning into height. To ascend San Lorenzo was to approach the divine. Every terrace, every stairway was a statement carved in earth: we have mastered the floods. We have earned the right to endure. But the marvel of San Lorenzo wasn't only its scale, it was its precision. The plateau's surface was carefully leveled. Plazas aligned with the cardinal directions. Causeways paved with basalt blocks linked ceremonial zones to living quarters. Even the drainage system, stone-lined channels that still gleam with ancient polish, spoke of a genius for practicality wrapped in ritual. Water, once a threat, now moved through the city like a tamed serpent, redirected to feed gardens, cool plazas, and cleanse altars. The Olmec engineers didn't separate the sacred from the functional. For them, a drain could be a prayer. In the city's center stood broad courtyards, surrounded by raised platforms, where wooden temples once perched their walls painted red and black. The smell of burning copal resin hung in the air. Musicians beat drums carved from hollowed logs. Priests wearing jaguar skins raised their arms toward the east at sunrise. Between ceremonies, artisans worked in shaded workshops. Jade carvers hunched over green stones. Potters painting white rims on black vessels. Lapidaries polishing obsidian until it shimmered like frozen smoke. Civilization is often measured in monuments, but its soul lives in such sounds: the rasp of stone, the murmur of trade, the crackle of cooking fires echoing up the terraces. San Lorenzo was not a city of marble, but of earth and imagination. Its foundations were alive, constantly shifting with the rains. To maintain it required faith and coordination, a civic religion disguised as engineering. Workers repaired terraces each season, their songs blending with the rumble of thunder. Children learned early that their lives depended on balance between water and clay, between obedience and innovation, between the gods above and the serpents below. And everywhere, the faces began to appear. From the quarries of the Tuxtla Mountains, 60 kilometers away, came massive blocks of basalt, dark, heavy, and defiant. Teams of laborers dragged them through jungle and swamp, using wooden rollers and rope, each block weighing as much as 50 tons. The journey took weeks. When at last they reached the city, the sculptors, artists, and engineers in equal measure set to work with stone hammers and wooden wedges. Chip by chip, they released giants from the rock, the colossal heads. 17 of them once stood across San Lorenzo, each between 1 and 3 meters tall, each carved with human precision. Thick lips, broad noses, deep-set eyes beneath elaborate helmets. They were not generic faces. Each had personality, stern, proud, sometimes weary, as though capturing individual rulers in volcanic portraiture. Their helmets may have marked lineage, military role, or sacred function. Scholars still debate, but standing before them even now, it's hard not to feel that you are being regarded by someone who expects obedience. Imagine approaching one in its prime polished surface, gleaming with rain, positioned along a processional path, torches flickering against the basalt. The ruler's likeness gazes toward the horizon, massive and calm. You, a farmer or craftsman, would bow instinctively. This was stone made human and humanity made immortal. When words were few, art carried authority. The colossal heads were not alone. Smaller monuments dotted the plaza's altars, shaped like thrones, slabs carved with scenes of rulers emerging from caves, serpents coiling around human figures. Each told the same story. The city's leaders were not merely men and women. They were mediators between realms, the living embodiment of balance. The architecture, the sculpture, even the water channels reinforced this message. Everything flowed toward the center, where human and divine met in engineered harmony. Daily life thrived around the ceremonial heart. Common families lived on the lower slopes, their houses arranged in clusters with small gardens of maize and beans. Craftsmen occupied workshops near the causeways. Elite residences crowned the terraces built of sturdier materials, decorated with colored clay and polished stone floors. At night, the lights from hundreds of hearths would shimmer through the rising mist, reflected in the canals, a constellation reversed upon the earth. To outsiders, San Lorenzo must have seemed impossible, a city of earth that defied both jungle and flood. Traders from distant lands brought obsidian jade and exotic feathers. They left with awe. And as they returned home, they carried stories of the great hill that glowed like a torch at sunset, of rulers whose faces were carved into mountains of priests who could summon rain and predict the stars. Thus, the legend of the Olmecs began to spread, carried not by conquest, but by admiration. From the terrace edges, one could look out across the shimmering plains and see the reflection of all that had been achieved. A people who once followed rivers had now taught those rivers to serve them. Their city breathed with the pulse of the earth itself, seasonal, cyclical, alive. It was not eternal, but it was enduring, and that distinction mattered. For the first time, the Americas had a capital. By the time the first colossal head was raised, San Lorenzo had already become more than a settlement. It was a statement. Its terraces hummed with life, its canals whispered like veins beneath a body. Yet what truly made the city breathe were the faces staring out from its plazas, enormous, unblinking, and immortal. They called them the elders, the ancestors, or simply the watchers. Modern archaeologists gave them colder titles: Monument 1, Monument 2. But to the people who carved them, these were portraits of kings made eternal, and the process of creating them was a performance in itself, part engineering miracle, part cosmic drama. The story began 60 kilometers away, deep in the dark green folds of the Tuxtla Mountains. Their veins of basalt ran like ancient roots beneath the earth, hard and unyielding. In the quarries of Cerro Sintepec, crews of laborers set to work with nothing more than stone hammers, wooden wedges, and faith. You can almost hear the thud of mallets echoing through the jungle, the hiss of wet wood swelling in cracks, until with a sound like thunder, a giant boulder split free. These stones were immense, some weighing 40 or 50 tons, and their journey had only begun. The logistics alone bordered on the supernatural. No wheels, no beasts of burden, only human will and ingenuity. Hundreds of men and women cut paths through rainforest, laying logs for rollers, building temporary bridges over rivers, greasing the ground with clay and water to ease the stone's passage. Each meter of movement must have felt like a victory stolen from gravity. They dragged the boulders to the riverbanks, lashed them to wooden sleds or rafts, and floated them downstream. Some experiments suggest teams of 200 to 400 workers could move a 20-ton block 2 kilometers in a day, a pace both heroic and absurd. To feed such an effort required organization on a scale unseen before in the Americas: cooks, water carriers, rope makers, overseers, priests. It was a traveling city of labor bound together by a singular purpose to bring the mountain's heart to San Lorenzo. When the raft finally slid into the city's dock, crowds gathered in reverence. Children stared awestruck. Elders chanted prayers to keep the spirit of the stone appeased. Because in their worldview, basalt was alive, it contained the strength of the earth's bones. Carving it was not creation, it was negotiation. The sculptors themselves were specialists, artists who balanced brute force with an almost surgical delicacy. They chipped away the outer crust using hammerstones of harder rock, tracing rough forms, guided by sketches incised into the surface with charcoal and chalk. As the features emerged, brows, noses, lips, the sound of work changed from dull thuds to sharp clicks, then to the long rasp of polishing. Hours became weeks, weeks became months. The artisans learned the stone's moods, its soft seams, its hidden flaws. One wrong strike could shatter weeks of labor. And slowly, from volcanic shadow faces emerged. They were not idealized gods, but human intimately, so each different, each unmistakably individual. One has a wide, flattened nose and thick lips drawn in quiet concentration. Another wears a faint smile, eyes half closed, as if listening to something beyond hearing. Their helmets, carved with bands and knots, might have been war gear or ritual headdresses. Their ears bore round ornaments that glinted when polished. When finished, each head weighed as much as an elephant and stood taller than a man. The day a new head was erected, the city celebrated. Drums thundered, shells blared. The massive sculpture was rolled up an earthen ramp onto its platform and positioned with ritual precision, facing east toward the rising sun or west toward the ancestral lands. Priests anointed it with water maize flour and the blood of sacrifices speaking to the spirit trapped within. Now, you may watch over us, they might have said. Now, you are awake. To stand before one of these heads must have been a humbling experience. Imagine the plaza at dusk, torches, flickering shadows crawling across those immense faces. Their expressions shift with the light stern, one moment sorrowful the next. To the commoner, bringing offerings of maize or cacao, the impression was unmistakable. Power had a face, and it was looking right at you. Each head likely represented a ruler of San Lorenzo's dynasties, a lineage of priest kings whose authority balanced on both earthly skill and divine sanction. These were the men who commanded the irrigation-organized trade caravans and decided when to plant and when to sacrifice. Their faces carved in stone ensured their influence survived even after death. It was politics disguised as piety art, as propaganda, centuries before the term existed. There was also something deeply human about them. The sculptors didn't flatten their subjects into symbols. They gave them quirks, creases around the mouth, slight asymmetries, the weight of fatigue. Each head feels less like an idol and more like a memory, someone the carver knew, perhaps even loved or feared. That emotional precision is what startles modern visitors. Amid the abstraction of ancient art, these faces feel present. Across the city, other monuments multiplied. Basalt altars, shaped like thrones, bore carvings of rulers emerging from cave mouths, the symbolic wombs of the earth. To step from a cave was to be reborn as a mediator between worlds. On some, serpents coil around the figures. On others, infants with feline features or jaguars rest in their arms. Each relief whispered the same philosophy: the ruler's legitimacy came not from sword or spear, but from communion with forces older than time. Everywhere, the monumental and the spiritual blended. The same basalt used for sculpture lined the city's drainage canals. Water trickled through polished conduits, catching the torchlight and turning the flow itself into a living offering. Imagine the sound of it at night, a quiet rush beneath the plazas, echoing beneath the colossal heads like the pulse of the city itself. It wasn't all solemnity. San Lorenzo was alive with ordinary rhythms. Children played near the terraces. Potters fired vessels in smoky kilns. Traders haggled in open courtyards. The colossal heads looked down on it all. Guardians, yes, but also silent witnesses to the laughter, the gossip, the trivialities that make civilizations real. Perhaps that's why the Olmecs made them so human, to remind the living that greatness was not remote. It was reflected in the faces around them. When storms rolled in from the Gulf, lightning flashing over the wetlands, the heads gleamed under the rain, their surfaces slick and dark. People must have believed the gods themselves were washing the ancestors clean. Thunder became applause for stone and labor. And when morning came, sunlight poured over those features with golden tenderness, as if to say the contract between heaven and earth was renewed. Thousands of years later, their power still holds. Visitors standing before them often whisper, without realizing it, the way one does in cathedrals. The basalt giants are more than relics. Their testimonies carved into the planet, the first human signatures written on Mesoamerica's skin. Each one says, "We were here. We dreamed in stone." In San Lorenzo, the heads watched as the city reached its zenith, its rulers adorned in jade, its workshops humming its ceremonies, echoing through the valley. But in time, even the watchers would see decline creeping from the horizon. For now, though, the plateau was alive, the rivers tamed, and the people believed their faces would last forever. The kings had become mountains. The mountains had become memory. And beneath the humid sky, the first empire of the Americas gazed calmly into eternity. By the time the colossal head stood, sentinel, San Lorenzo had matured into something both grand and intimate, a city breathing with thousands of lives stacked layer upon layer like the clay it was built from. From above, it looked orderly in serene terraces and causeways forming geometric patterns, drainage lines glinting in the sun. But within those lines flowed the true pulse of the Olmecs markets, laughter smoke and human ambition. At dawn, the mist still hugged the ground. The upper terraces where the elite compounds stood caught the first light, while the lower slopes lingered in blue shadow. From the palaces came the faint sound of conch shell trumpets announcing morning rituals. Servants swept courtyards of colored clay, sprinkling water to keep down the dust. The air smelled of maize dough and incense. Below, fishermen hauled in night nets, their canoes sliding across the quiet surface of the Coatzacoalcos River like black silhouettes. The city was waking. To walk through San Lorenzo, in its prime, was to walk through a vertical world of status. At the top, the ruler priests, the living link between man and cosmos, occupied residences built with a confidence no one could mistake for modesty. Their houses rose on stone platforms, several meters high, their walls daubed in bright red, and ochre floors laid with polished clay and crushed shells. Roof beams of hardwood supported upper rooms, where jade ornaments and embroidered cotton tunics gleamed under the filtered light. Rainwater channels lined with basalt drained the storms neatly away civilization's quiet luxury. These compounds weren't isolated castles, they were command centers. Here, decisions about canal maintenance, trade routes, and ritual calendars were made. Messengers padded up the causeways carrying baskets of tribute shells, cacao-woven cloth, carved jade bowing low before entering the courtyards. Every object was both commodity and prayer. For to the Olmecs, economics and cosmology were twin languages describing the same thing, how energy flowed through the world. Immediately below, the elite terraces lived the specialists, craftsmen, stoneworkers, and potters whose skills gave the city its soul. Their workshops clattered with purpose. Flint struck basalt in staccato rhythm. Women smoothed wet clay with practiced hands. Apprentices turned obsidian cores until thin, shimmering blades flaked off like glass feathers. The smell of wet earth and wood smoke mingled with that of roasting maize and drying fish. Work was worship, and mastery was a kind of prayer. In one corner, the jade carvers worked in patient silence. Their benches were lined with drills made from reeds, and cords, their basins filled with abrasive powder of ground quartz. Hours turned to days as they polished the luminous green stone to mirror brightness. Each bead or pendant destined for the neck of a noble or the altar of a god carried weeks of invisible breath and sweat. When finished, it rang like a bell. When struck clear, otherworldly, the sound of prestige. Potters, meanwhile, made miracles of fire. Their kilns burned hot enough to singe the air, and from those flames emerged vessels so fine their thin walls seemed impossible. White-rimmed black bowls, figurines of jaguar-faced infants' jars painted with curling symbols that may have whispered the first steps toward writing. These artisans had become philosophers of material turning mud into permanence, much as their city had turned swampland into order. Still lower down the terraces sprawled the homes of the common people, the backbone of San Lorenzo. Families lived in houses of thatch and wattle raised on small earthen mounds to keep out floods. Chickens, dogs, and children mingled freely. Maize and beans dried in baskets at the doorway. Their daily rhythm was timeless, tending the fields, mending nets, gossiping at wells. Yet even these modest homes were part of a grand machine. The farmers fed the city. The laborers maintained its causeways. The women wove the cotton that wrapped its rulers in softness. Each act planting, weaving, carving was a thread in the tapestry of the state. At midday, the plazas filled. Merchants spread woven mats covered with treasures from far-off lands, obsidian from the highlands, shells from the coasts, cacao beans from the humid south feathers shimmering in impossible hues. The market was as much theater as trade. Buyers examined goods with feigned disinterest. Sellers bragged, joked, and invoked ancestral blessings over their wares. Somewhere nearby, a musician beat a hollow drum, the rhythm bouncing off the stone terraces like heartbeats. Children chased one another between stalls, while dogs barked, and the scent of roasted maize cakes mingled with that of sweat and incense. Even here, hierarchy was visible. The elite watched from shaded arcades, attended by servants, fanning away flies with palm leaves. Their presence was both blessing and warning prosperity existed by their will. Yet the distance between classes wasn't only measured in altitude. During great festivals, everyone gathered in the central plazas to dance chant and offer gifts to the gods of rain and earth. For a night, perhaps the lines blurred. The potter, the farmer, the priest, all joined in the same hypnotic rhythm under the firelit sky. Then dawn came, and hierarchy returned with the sun. San Lorenzo's planners had understood something fundamental, that power is geography. The terraces didn't merely separate classes, they told a story. The higher one climbed, the closer to the sacred. The ruler's palace crowned the city, not only because it was safer from floods, but because altitude itself symbolized dominion. From that vantage, the ruler could look down upon every roof, every field, a literal eye of order. The Olmecs turned landscape into ideology. Religion infused everything. In the courtyards of the elite small altars burned night and day. Priests observed the stars from raised platforms charting when the sun would cross certain points along the horizon. Their calendars guided both sowing and sacrifice. At appointed times, processions wound through the plazas, priests with jaguar pelts and feathered fans, children scattering flower petals, musicians blowing conch shells that echoed across the wetlands like the cry of distant whales. At the ceremony's climax, the ruler himself appeared body-painted with red pigment jade beads clinking at his throat. The crowd fell silent. In that hush, the city held its breath, believing him to be the mediator who kept the rivers obedient and the maize tall. As dusk came, San Lorenzo shimmered. Fires lit the terraces like constellations on the earth. From above, it might have looked as though the stars themselves had descended for the night. Along the causeways, silhouettes moved, laborers returning home, priests carrying torches, lovers sneaking toward the riverbank. The drainage channels murmured softly beneath the streets, carrying away the day's rain. Even the city's engineering seemed to sigh content. But beneath that, peace, subtle tension stirred. Prosperity breeds envy, and complexity breeds fragility. The rulers adorned in jade and power relied on the same farmers who lived ankle-deep in mud. If the rains ever failed or came too heavy, the delicate equilibrium could fracture. For now, though, San Lorenzo gleamed like a miracle balanced on clay. The people slept, believing their city was eternal. The colossal heads kept their silent vigil, their heavy-lidded eyes reflecting the flicker of distant hearths. In the humid nights of San Lorenzo, when rain drummed softly against the clay roofs and the torches burned low, the city took on another life. Shadows flickered on plastered walls, and every shape seemed to breathe. The farmers might call it darkness. The priests called it presence. They believed that when the sun slipped beneath the horizon, the boundaries between worlds thinned. Men could dream their way into the skin of beasts, and the gods walked among them. At the heart of that belief crouched the jaguar. To the Olmecs, the jaguar was not simply an animal. It was power incarnate, a hunter that saw in the dark, that swam as easily as it stalked, that could vanish into the jungle without a sound. It was everything a human was not stronger, faster, invisible, and therefore everything a human ruler might wish to become. Somewhere between admiration and terror, the jaguar slipped into myth and religion, transforming from predator to ancestor, from beast to bridge between realms. The earliest sculptors captured it as best they could. Stone bodies with human faces, human torsos, sprouting fanged mouths, infants with feline eyes and cleft heads. Archaeologists would later call them jaguars, but that word hardly fits. These were not half-human monsters. They were metaphors carved in jade and basalt, the Olmec vision of transformation made tangible. The artists were not illustrating stories, they were describing states of being. Picture an Olmec carver seated in his workshop, jade dust glinting on his arms. Before him lies a figurine barely larger than his palm, an infant with soft, round limbs, its lips curled in a snarl. The carver leans closer, polishing the stone until it gleams like dew. To him, this is no toy. It is an offering, a conduit. In its green surface lives the hope that humanity can borrow a little of the jaguar's strength, its night vision, its calm ferocity. That yearning for transformation shaped the Olmec spiritual world. The priests who ruled San Lorenzo claimed descent from the jaguar, or at least its blessing. During ceremonies, they donned pelts and headdresses studded with fangs, their faces painted with black spots, their eyes rimmed in gold dust. As drums thundered and flutes keened through the humid air, they danced until sweat and incense blurred their shapes. To the crowd, watching from the plaza, their movements seemed to ripple between human and animal, a choreography of metamorphosis. Ritual bloodletting accompanied these performances. It was not violence for its own sake. It was negotiation. The Olmecs believed life flowed in cycles of energy that required constant renewal. Blood, the most potent essence of all, was a gift to the gods to keep the cosmic machinery running. Men drew obsidian blades across their ears or thighs, letting the crimson drops fall into jade bowls, while women pricked their tongues with stingray spines. Pain was a doorway, not a punishment. Through it, the participants touched something beyond themselves, the pulse of the jaguar spirit that prowled between worlds. Across the city, altars bore witness to these mysteries. Some depicted rulers emerging from the gaping mouth of a cave, the symbolic womb of the earth. Others showed serpents coiling around human figures, birds transforming mid-flight into men. The jaguar was everywhere, carved into throne faces, painted on pottery, incised into polished celts, buried in caches beneath the plazas. Its grin, eternal and unsettling, seemed to watch from every corner. In that grin lay both warning and promise. Nothing stays one thing forever. The Olmec cosmos revolved around such dualities. Day and night, male and female rain and drought, human and beast, all were necessary halves of the same circle. Their gods were not distant overseers, but shapeshifters who mirrored this balance. A priest might invoke a rain deity with a human body, and jaguar jaws symbolizing the wild storm, tamed by human will. To maintain harmony, one had to acknowledge both sides, to feed the jungle as one farmed it, to honor the predator as one hunted. Civilization was not a triumph over nature. It was a contract with it. Inside, elite houses, small shrines echoed the great temples. Families kept figurines on low shelves, some of women in childbirth, others of children with feline faces. They prayed for safe harvests, for strong suns, for courage in the night. The women especially found comfort in these hybrid beings. They embodied both motherhood and danger, the power to create and to defend. Archaeologists later uncovered caches of such figurines buried beneath floorboards, tiny acts of devotion sealed into the very foundations of daily life. Astronomy intertwined with this faith. The jaguar's spotted coat reminded priests of the night sky, its rosettes, like constellations moving through darkness. When storms rolled in and lightning clawed across the heavens, they said it was the jaguar leaping between stars. Observatories, simple raised platforms aligned to the solstices, allowed them to predict the rains, weaving celestial order into earthly survival. Each successful prediction reinforced the ruler's divine authority. He who could read the sky could command the earth. In the cool interiors of temples, the air heavy with copal smoke chants echoed through carved corridors. The language was rhythmic, repetitive, part prayer, part trance induction. Listeners swayed, eyes half closed, until they too felt the shiver of transformation. Perhaps that was the essence of Olmec spirituality, not to worship the jaguar from afar, but to feel it breathing beneath one's own skin. Art carried the message far beyond the city. Traders carried jade pendants, shaped like snarling feline faces, to distant villages spreading both the aesthetic and the theology. Soon across Mesoamerica, other peoples adopted the motif, the jaguar, as power, as ancestry, as doorway to the divine. What began as local reverence became continental mythology. Even the later Maya would call their kings Balam jaguars, echoing the Olmec dream. For the common people of San Lorenzo, faith was not confined to ceremonies. Every sound, every scent had meaning. The roar of a real jaguar in the distance was not coincidence, it was communication. Farmers paused mid-harvest, pressing their palms to the earth, murmuring thanks for the reminder that power still prowled in the forest. Children were taught to respect both danger and mystery. To mock the unseen was to invite imbalance. In time, this reverence shaped how the Olmecs saw themselves. Their rulers did not rule by decree alone. They embodied transformation. To change the landscape, to carve rivers into canals, to raise hills into platforms, was to perform a cosmic act no different from the jaguar shifting form in the night. Architecture became ritual labor, became liturgy. The city itself was a body undergoing metamorphosis, each rainy season, a living proof that humans could harness the divine pattern of change. When the rains finally ended, and the air turned clear, the colossal heads glistened anew. Their heavy features seemed to share the same feline grace, the thick lips curling almost imperceptibly at the corners, the down-turned eyes catching the last gleam of sun. It is easy standing before them, even now, to imagine that they knew something we've forgotten, that beneath every civilization's calm smile waits a jaguar's hunger, the endless desire to become more than human. Night over San Lorenzo was never silent. Even after the markets emptied and the laughter of the lower terraces faded into the reeds, the city breathed through its drains, through its torches, through the pulse of drums that never quite ceased. The Olmecs lived by rhythms deeper than trade or harvest. Their calendar was written in the turning of the stars, their faith in the weight of blood and the whisper of smoke. Each ritual was a negotiation between sky and soil, between order and the wild forces that forever threatened to flood, scorch, or swallow their fragile perfection. The plazas were the stage. Imagine one before dawn, torches spitting in the mist, the air thick with the scent of pine resin and human anticipation. Around the edges, hundreds gather farmers, artisans, children perched on their fathers' shoulders, the hum of expectation rising like static. At the center stands an altar of basalt, dark and slick as wet obsidian. Beside it, the priests wait in silence, their faces striped with ochre and charcoal. On their arms gleam jade bracelets carved in the shape of jaguar claws. The crowd barely breathes. Then a conch shell moans across the plaza, long, low, like the first note of creation. The ceremony begins. The priests chant the names of the gods of water, earth, fire, and sky. They lift bowls filled with maize, cacao, and flowers toward the stars still fading overhead. To an outsider, it might look theatrical. To the Olmecs, it was the scaffolding of reality. The gods needed reminders, persuasion, gratitude in the proper proportions. Or else the rivers would swell too soon, the sun would refuse to rise, and the delicate balance holding civilization together would unravel. Blood was the currency of that balance. The Olmecs didn't fear it, they revered it. They understood what modern biology would only rediscover thousands of years later, that life itself was a current. To offer blood was to pay one's debt to existence, to keep the cosmic gears turning. A priest draws a stingray spine across his thigh. The skin splits red trickles into a shallow bowl lined with crushed jade. Another uses an obsidian blade so sharp it gleams blue. The cuts are small, deliberate, never savage. The blood steams in the cool air, mingling with the sweet smoke of copal resin. To the watchers, it smells like rain before it falls. The high priest, his face hidden behind a jaguar mask, steps forward to anoint a figurine carved from green stone. The figurine depicts a man half transformed, its mouth open in silent roar. The blood stains its fangs, trickles down to the altar, then into a drain cut into the stone that carries the offering toward the earth. Below the plaza, the sound of rushing water answers faintly, as though the gods themselves are drinking. When the chanting ends, silence returns, not awkward, but absolute, as if the city itself is listening for a sign that the bargain has been accepted. Then a breeze passes through the plaza, lifting the smoke toward the heavens. The crowd exhales together. The world for now is safe. Not all rituals were solemn. Some were exuberant, celebratory. When the rains came on schedule, or the harvest overflowed, the plazas erupted with music. Dancers in feathered costumes leapt and twirled their movements, tracing the cycles of time. Flutes carved from bone wailed like birds. Turtle shells became drums. Maracas shook like thunder. Every motion was a metaphor, the sower scattering seed, the serpent shedding skin, the jaguar leaping across the stars. The Olmecs didn't simply pray to their gods. They reenacted them, turning worship into choreography. Above these earthly dramas, the sky itself served as scripture. The priests of San Lorenzo were astronomers long before the word existed. From raised platforms, they watched the sun's slow migration along the horizon, marking its rising points with poles or stones. They noted when Venus appeared as morning star, when certain constellations dipped below the jungle canopy. Patterns became prophecies. The heavens weren't chaos, they were a clock. At certain times of the year, processions climbed the terraces to witness the sun rise between specific mounds or align perfectly with the city's main causeway. The priests declared these moments sacred proof that the universe was listening. They recorded them not with ink, but in architecture, each alignment a stone sentence written to eternity. In this way, San Lorenzo itself became a giant instrument for tracking the cosmos. The city was not just inhabited, it was observed by the stars, and it observed back. The Olmecs believed their gods lived in cycles of birth, death, and rebirth, mirrored by the sun's daily journey. Each sunset was a descent into the underworld, each dawn a resurrection. Rulers who embodied these cosmic truths were more than kings, they were living calendars. During great festivals, the ruler would vanish into a temple at dusk and emerge at sunrise clothed in new garments, symbolically reborn. The crowd would erupt, drums rolling like thunder, for what they had just witnessed was the triumph of order over chaos, light over shadow. And still beneath the spectacle, something quieter endured: the personal faith of the ordinary people. In small courtyards, women burned incense before tiny altars of clay. Farmers buried kernels of maize in the corners of their fields as offerings to the earth spirits. Children wore amulets carved with the downturned jaguar mouth for protection. Every household kept its own relationship with the unseen, its own ledger of gratitude and fear. Religion was not imposed from above. It seeped upward from the soil. Yet no ceremony, however grand or humble, escaped the shadow of blood. To us, it seems grim, but to them, it was intimacy, the way to speak the gods' language. Some rituals even incorporated the watery landscape itself. Archaeologists have found caches of jade axes and figurines buried in the wet earth near springs, arranged as if for underwater temples. Imagine the priests wading through the marsh, moonlight rippling across their faces, lowering the gleaming offerings into the dark water. Each piece vanished with a soft hiss, swallowed by the mud that fed their crops. Give to the earth, and it gives back. At night, when the rituals were done and the fires dwindled, the priests climbed the highest terrace to read the sky. The Milky Way arched overhead like a celestial river. They called it the Road of Souls. Venus burned bright near the horizon, a torch guiding spirits through the night. And in the southern constellations, they saw the jaguar again sprawled across the heavens, its spots glowing with starlight. It was easy to believe that somewhere up there, their ancestors prowled beside it. Below the city slept in rhythms, set by that cosmic clock. The water in the canals reflected both stars and torchlight, blurring heaven and earth into one glimmering sheet. Every structure, every ritual, every drop of blood spilled on basalt tied the people to something immeasurable. They didn't build monuments just to endure time, they built them to speak to it. Even gods, it seemed, could appreciate good engineering. San Lorenzo, the jewel of the wetlands, thrived not just because of its ceremonies and sculpture, but because its builders had mastered the one force that defined life on the Gulf Coast water. It gave it drowned, it nourished it destroyed. To live here was to live in conversation with it. And in that conversation, the Olmecs became poets in clay and stone writing verses that channeled rivers and outwitted floods. To step into the city during the rainy season was to feel the genius of their design under your feet. Beneath the plazas, the earth was laced with stone-lined drains, hundreds of them, like the veins of a living body. Rainwater poured from the sky, rushed down terraces, vanished through carved basalt channels, and reappeared in controlled streams farther below. It was a hidden orchestra of movement, the whisper of trickling water underfoot, the echo of flow through underground conduits. What elsewhere would have been disaster became ritual performance. The Olmec engineers did not build walls against the floods. They invited them in, gave them paths, trained them like sacred serpents. Each rainy season, the water descended from the Tuxtla Mountains, heavy with volcanic ash and minerals. Instead of running wild, it glided through the city's arteries, feeding reservoirs and irrigation channels that fanned outward into the farmlands. The system worked with the landscape, not against it, a philosophy rare in ancient engineering and rarer still in ours. To maintain these systems took constant attention. Workers cleared blockages, repaired cracked stones, and scraped away silt deposits under the watchful eye of priestly overseers. Maintenance was worship here. A clean drain was a kind of hymn. The lines between labor and liturgy blurred until they were indistinguishable. Every bucket of water, lifted every stone reset in its trench, was an act of devotion to both practicality and faith. Archaeologists later found that many of these drainage channels ended in basins deliberately shaped like altars. Water, after all, was the flesh of gods. It flowed from the heavens, carried life through the soil, and disappeared back underground, the same cycle their mythology used to describe birth, death, and rebirth. When the people poured offerings into these drains, copal resin maize, jade beads, they weren't throwing gifts away. They were returning them to the veins of the world. Engineering became a sacrament. It was this sacred understanding of flow, both literal and symbolic, that made the Olmecs masters of their environment. Where other early peoples fled the floods, the Olmecs domesticated them. They cut canals deep into the soft alluvial plains, creating a lattice of waterways that served both irrigation and transport. During the wet months, canoes glided past fields of maize and squash, the water itself reflecting the blue-green of the crops. In the dry season, those same canals became footpaths for trade. The system was flexible, alive, always moving, an extension of their cosmology, which saw no distinction between the physical and the divine. From the higher terraces, Priests watched the seasonal patterns with scientific precision. They noted when the river crested, when certain birds returned, when the soil darkened just so. Their rituals of asking the gods for rain may in truth have been more about marking these natural signals. Yet the Olmecs did not separate observation from reverence. If a priest predicted the rains correctly, the people didn't say he was clever, they said he was blessed. Knowledge here was divine correspondence. Within this hydraulic miracle, art and function intertwined. Basalt blocks, carved into serpent shapes, lined key drainage channels, their open jaws releasing water after storms. The serpent symbols of life and transformation turned the act of flood control into spectacle. When the rains fell hard and the drains roared, the people would gather at the plazas to watch the serpents spitting silver streams, water shining under torchlight. Children would laugh, elders would nod solemnly, and priests would murmur that the gods were pleased. The city wasn't resisting nature, it was performing with it. The Olmecs engineers were as spiritual as their priests, though their prayers were measured in gradient and gravity. They understood how to make water travel downhill without eroding, how to channel pressure through narrow conduits, how to curve stones so they fit tight enough to last centuries. Some of those channels still exist today, silent, empty, but perfect. Their craftsmanship outlived the civilization that made them. In the quiet between storms, the network turned gentle. Water trickled down channels into the ceremonial courtyards where basins caught it for washing, for cooling, for ritual purification. During major festivals, priests used that same system to flood select plazas, shallowly transforming them into shimmering mirrors that reflected the sky. To stand there ankle-deep in the water, surrounded by torchlight and drums, must have felt like walking inside a reflection of the cosmos, a place where heaven and earth met at last. Even the city's acoustics were engineered. Some scholars believe the drainage tunnels were intentionally shaped to amplify the sound of running water, turning every storm into a low, resonant hum beneath the plazas. Imagine standing in the rain and hearing the ground sing a bass note beneath the thunder, the city itself participating in the ritual of sound. No wonder the Olmecs thought of their home as alive. But the system wasn't just technical or aesthetic, it was political. Control of water meant control of life. The rulers and priests who oversaw these networks commanded not only divine authority, but the literal ability to feed or starve the people. To announce the beginning of the planting season, the ruler would ceremonially open a new canal gate, the first gush of water pouring forth amid chants and cheers. In that moment, leadership was sanctified. The ruler was the human valve between chaos and abundance. The canals also connected San Lorenzo to the broader world. Traders paddled their canoes along these waterways, linking inland villages to the coast. Salt obsidian and shells flowed one way, maize, jade, and crafted goods the other. Every trade route began with water. Every story followed its course. It was no coincidence that the Olmec word for world may have also meant stream. To move was to live. And so day after day, season after season, the city's life moved in cycles of flow rain to river, to drain, to field, back to sky. The same water that cooled the ruler's hands in ritual was the water that soaked the peasants' maize roots. The same serpent-carved channel that carried offerings to the gods carried away the city's runoff after a storm. Every drop traced a path through the entire hierarchy, uniting palace and hut altar and furrow. The Olmecs had achieved what many later civilizations would only dream of: balance. When San Lorenzo finally began to quiet its terraces, crumbling its drains, silting with mud, its colossal heads half buried by neglect, the spirit of the Olmecs did not die. It simply drifted eastward, following the same rivers that had once carried basalt and maize and myth. There beyond the mangrove swamps of modern Tabasco, an island waited in the green silence, a mound of high ground, surrounded by shimmering marshes and tidal lagoons. To later generations, it would be called La Venta, but to the Olmecs who found it, it was a promise of rebirth. The first settlers arrived around 900 BC, paddling through the dense web of channels that wound through the wetlands. From a distance, the island looked unremarkable, a hummock of earth dotted with palms barely 5 kilometers long. But to people obsessed with balance between water and land, it was a miracle of equilibrium, safe from floods, fertile with clay close to the sea. They stepped ashore, planted their first maize, and began again. What they built there would eclipse everything they had left behind. La Venta rose like a vision. Its builders were no longer tentative experimenters. They were descendants of a tradition already rich with engineering, art, and religion. They brought with them memories of San Lorenzo's terraces and drains of colossal heads and cosmic alignments. But on this island, they refined them into something almost mathematical. The city was planned from the start, a north-south axis, cutting straight through the heart of the settlement, every plaza and platform calibrated to the stars. Here, the Olmecs fused architecture with astronomy, landscape with theology. The first act was audacious. They sculpted the earth itself into a pyramid. Not the stepped stone-faced kind we imagine from later ages, but a fluted cone of clay rising 34 meters into the sky. 10 ridges ran down its sides like the folds of a god's robe. From a distance, under the tropical haze, it glowed faintly gold. It was not merely a temple. It was a mountain, summoned by hand, a man-made horizon, visible for miles across the wetlands. To climb it was to ascend from the realm of serpents and reeds to the kingdom of clouds. Building such a structure on a swamp required feats of ingenuity that still baffle engineers. The Olmecs drove thousands of wooden piles deep into the soft ground, layering colored clays, red, yellow, white, black, to stabilize the core. Each layer symbolized an element of creation: fire, wind, water, earth. The pyramid wasn't just stable, it was cosmological engineering. Within its belly, archaeologists have found offering pits filled with jade, obsidian, and serpentine sealed beneath each new construction phase, as though feeding the structure's spirit. The pyramid was alive, growing generation by generation, its body sanctified with every layer of soil. Around it spread an intricate ceremonial complex of plazas, platforms, and causeways. Complex A, the main ritual precinct, stretched more than 150 meters across its surface, paved with clay mosaics arranged in geometric designs visible only from above. Standing there must have been dizzying the ground itself, a painting the air thick with incense and heat. To the north stood Complex B, a sunken courtyard encircled by stepped platforms where public ceremonies and perhaps the earliest ball games were held. The Olmecs loved performance processions, moving in rhythm drums, rolling like thunder dancers, painted as jaguars, and serpents reenacting the creation of the world. Everywhere color. The Olmecs layered different clays for visual drama: red floors, yellow embankments, white plaster gleaming under the sun. Even in ruins, La Venta still looks theatrical. But beneath that spectacle lay profound precision. The entire city faced 8 degrees west of true north, an alignment scholars now know matched the rising of certain stars and the solar cycle marking the agricultural calendar. For the priests who ruled here, to build wrongly would be to offend the heavens. To align correctly was to synchronize the city's pulse with the cosmos. Then came the offerings, those buried masterpieces that make La Venta the most mysterious archaeological site in the Americas. Beneath the plazas, workers dug deep pits lined with colored sand and laid out mosaics of thousands of serpentine blocks, greenish stones arranged into abstract jaguar masks nearly 5 meters wide. When finished, they buried them completely. The art was never meant to be seen by human eyes. It existed for the gods below to decorate the underworld. In that act, the Olmecs revealed a paradox that defined them. They built beauty precisely to hide it. Nearby, in tombs lined with basalt columns, they placed their dead rulers wrapped in cotton and jaguar pelts, accompanied by jade masks composed of hundreds of tiny pieces. One such mask, still luminous after 25 centuries, stares back with lips slightly parted and a faint feline curve to its cheeks. It is neither human nor animal, but something between, as if the deceased might still be mid-transformation. Beside the body lay axes, beads, and figurines, each carved from jade, so pure it seemed to hold its own light. Death for the Olmecs was not an ending, but a migration to another form. The workshops of Venta hummed day and night. Here artisans reached technical heights the ancient world rarely matched. Obsidian blades from far-off highlands were trimmed thinner than paper. Magnetite was polished into mirrors so clear they could start fires by focusing sunlight. Some of these mirrors, perfectly concave, were placed on altars where they reflected the flame of torches upward, turning light itself into a ritual participant. In their shimmering surfaces, priests claimed to glimpse the faces of gods, or perhaps their own. Trade routes radiated from this island like spokes from a wheel. Canoes laden with jade from Guatemala, shells from the Caribbean, and cacao from Chiapas arrived through its watery corridors. Each delivery was greeted with ceremony traders purified in sacred pools before entering the precincts. Goods presented before the pyramid as tribute to both ruler and deity. La Venta had become more than a city. It was a pilgrimage site, a magnetic hub where the physical and the metaphysical converged. The rulers of La Venta understood the power of spectacle. Public rituals blurred the line between governance and theater. Imagine a procession at sunrise. Drums echo across the wetlands as hundreds of participants, priests, dancers, laborers, move in coordinated rhythm down the main causeway. At the front walks the ruler face, painted black and red, carrying a jade scepter carved like a maize stalk. Behind him, attendants burn incense in ceramic braziers, the smoke rising in spirals that mirror the conical pyramid behind them. The people kneel as he ascends the steps, and for one electric moment, the horizon seems to balance on his silhouette. In that instant, faith and power are indistinguishable. From the pyramid's summit, one could see the full theater of creation, the rivers glimmering to the west, the jungle stretching unbroken to the east, the gulf shimmering like a polished mirror. When the sun sank, it painted the wetlands crimson and gold, and the entire city seemed to glow. The priests said the gods lived here because light itself paused to admire the view. Night at La Venta brought a different kind of beauty. The air cooled. Frogs began their chorus. Torches lit the plazas in wavering amber, their reflections rippling across the canal waters. Somewhere in the darkness, a flute began to play a melody older than memory. The pyramid loomed above its ridges, catching moonlight, its shadow stretching across the island like an outstretched hand. For the Olmecs below, it was more than architecture. It was the axis of the world, the still point where heaven, earth, and the underworld met. In La Venta, the Olmec genius found its purest form. The city floated between land and water, between myth and mathematics. Its people believed they had built not merely a settlement, but a living map of the cosmos, a place where the gods could descend, admire their reflection in the canals, and recognize themselves in human creation. The island slept that way for centuries, a luminous dream suspended above the swamp. Its fires burned through storms. Its pyramid watched the stars wheel across the sky. The heartland had moved, but the soul of a civilization still beat steady patient, like the slow lap of water against sacred clay. By the time La Venta reached its height, sometime between 800 and 600 BC, the island city had become less a settlement and more a shrine. Everything, from the layout of its plazas to the color of its soil, was built to speak in symbols. To walk its avenues was to stroll through a living myth. The pyramids glowed red and yellow in the afternoon light. The air smelled of copal and salt, and beneath your feet, unseen, but everywhere, treasures slept in the dark. The Olmecs buried prayers in jade. Each festival season, workers dug new offering pits into the heart of the ceremonial zone. They lined them with bright sand white for sky red for earth, black for the underworld, and then began the slow ritual of filling. Obsidian knives, polished jade axes, serpentine figurines, and hundreds of tiny green beads were arranged in patterns so precise they resembled constellations. Priests chanted above the pits, while musicians played slow, looping rhythms meant to echo the beat of rain on palm leaves. When everything was ready, the treasures were covered again, layer by layer, soil by soil, so that the gods below might see them, though no living eye ever would. This hidden art reached its most haunting form in Offering 4. Discovered millennia, later 16 miniature figures, carved from jade serpentine and basalt, each barely the height of a man's thumb, standing in a semicircle before 6 polished jade celts that rose from the ground like a wall or a portal. The figures face inward toward one another, caught forever in silent conversation. Some scholars call it a council of gods, others a dramatization of a mythic event. To stand above it today, glass and museum lights, replacing torch and incense, is to feel the intimacy of an ancient negotiation still unresolved. Above ground, the rituals continued. La Venta's grand pyramid loomed at the city's axis, its fluted sides catching sun and rain like an enormous sundial. The Olmecs did not climb it casually. Ascending the pyramid was a pilgrimage reserved for high priests and rulers in ceremonial regalia. Their garments shimmered with jade beads, obsidian mirrors, and bright feathers. Their faces bore streaks of cinnabar red, symbolizing the blood of creation. From the summit, they surveyed the wetlands, water glittering like sheets of hammered metal, and in the distance, the faint shadow of the Tuxtla Mountains, ancestral home of the stones from which their monuments were carved. To those below, the view must have looked supernatural, a man silhouetted against the burning horizon, holding aloft a jade axe that flashed like green lightning. In that gesture, the heavens and the earth briefly acknowledged one another. The mosaic pavements were another marvel of the age. Made from thousands of rectangular serpentine blocks, each stone shaped by hand, they were arranged into abstract faces, possibly jaguars, possibly deities of maize and rain, and then immediately buried beneath new clay floors. The builders never intended anyone to walk on them. They were messages sent downward, secret offerings to the earth's hidden gods. The act itself was the devotion perfection made only for those who would never see it. In that paradox, art for the unseen, lay something almost modern, the understanding that faith's beauty often lives in silence. Deep beneath one such pavement lay Tume, the resting place of a ruler or priest. His body was wrapped in cotton and jaguar pelts, surrounded by a collection of offerings so rich they glimmer even in photographs. Obsidian blades, shell ornaments, and a jade mask so finely worked it seems to breathe. The face, serene and childlike, is unmistakably Olmec almond eyes, full lips, the faint suggestion of feline power. Whether it was meant to portray the dead man himself or the god he hoped to become, no one can say. But as the tomb was sealed, incense burning, the mourners must have believed he was not dying, merely changing form, entering the green eternity that jade symbolized. For the Olmecs, jade was not a luxury, it was the substance of divinity. It gleamed like captured water, cool to the touch, yet luminous in sunlight. They believed it carried the essence of life, the breath of maize, the color of renewal. To wear it was to borrow the vitality of the cosmos. Their craftsmen treated it with reverence bordering on obsession, hours of grinding with sand and string drills to pierce a single bead, days spent polishing a pendant until it caught the reflection of clouds. When one of these pieces broke, it wasn't discarded. The fragments were carefully placed in caches, as though even broken divinity deserved a burial. The wealth of Venta astonished even its neighbors. Traders from distant coasts arrived bearing goods and gossip. They spoke of the island of the gods, where rulers shone in jewels, where the pyramid was a mountain of light, where offerings lay beneath every courtyard like veins of emerald. Some stayed, joining the workshops. Others returned home, carrying Olmec motifs and myths that would ripple across Mesoamerica for centuries. Yet the splendor was not merely material, it was ideological. Venta's rulers understood that grandeur reinforced faith. The more magnificent the offerings, the more tangible the god's presence seemed. A city that could bury such treasures without regret declared confidence in its abundance, in the reciprocity between people and deities. Generosity toward the unseen guaranteed prosperity for the living. The logic was circular, but it worked. Harvests remained bountiful, the rivers faithful, the people content. Still, beneath the ceremonial calm, a quiet melancholy pulsed. The Olmecs, masters of cycles, knew nothing stayed at its peak forever. The same rains that fed their fields slowly eroded their pyramids. The same rivers that carried trade could one day carry ruin. To build in clay was to acknowledge impermanence. Perhaps that's why they buried their finest works, to ensure that when the surface crumbled, the essence remained safe below sleeping until rediscovery. At night, after the festivals ended and the drums went silent, the priests would walk the edges of the pyramid, listening to the chorus of frogs and the soft sigh of wind through reeds. From the top, they could see torches still flickering in the distance, tiny reflections in the water, like a constellation of human stars. Somewhere beneath their feet lay thousands of stones carved and placed by hands now dust, and within those stones shimmered the faith of generations. The pyramid, the offerings, the jade masks, all were parts of a single conversation between humanity and eternity. The Olmecs didn't hope to conquer time. They hoped to anchor themselves within it, to leave behind echoes durable as stone and tender as light. And as dawn broke over Venta, the conical pyramid cast its long shadow across the swamp, touching the tips of palms and the still canals below. The shadow looked like an arrow, pointing east toward the rising sun, toward rebirth. In that moment, the entire island seemed to breathe with it, as if the gods themselves had stirred beneath the clay, smiling through the jade they had been offered. If Venta was an island of gods, its heartbeat was the steady rhythm of hammers and chisels echoing through its workshops. Behind the pyramid's grandeur and the glimmer of jade offerings stood a class of people rarely named in myths, the artisans. They were the quiet sorcerers of form, those who turned stone into prayer and clay into prophecy. In their hands, the divine took shape. From dawn to dusk, the sound of creation filled the air, the dry percussion of flint against basalt, the whisper of sand on jade, the creak of reed drills biting into green stone. These were not industrial noises. They were meditations, each tap a syllable in the Olmec language of devotion. Art here wasn't decoration. It was theology rendered tangible. Imagine one of these artisans bare-chested, crouched before a lump of translucent jadeite freshly arrived from the Guatemalan highlands. Light filters through the canopy, catching the gem's inner fire. He leans close, blowing away dust, already seeing the figure hidden within. To release it, he doesn't just carve. He converses. The process could take weeks. He drills with cords tipped in sand and quartz polishes with wet leather wipes the stone until it gleams like frozen rain. When at last the figurine emerges, a child with downturned mouth, its features soft and otherworldly, the artisan sighs, not in pride, but in relief. He has not made the image. He has uncovered it. Creation, to the Olmecs, was always revelation. Their workshops clustered near the ceremonial precinct were laboratories of both science and spirit. Potters experimented with clays, tinted red, white, and black, developing firing techniques that turned vessels glassy or matte according to need. Lapidaries studied the way jade refracted sunlight, perhaps believing each color shift corresponded to a god's mood. Obsidian workers, masters of fracture, learned to flake blades so sharp they could part a hair or a heartbeat. And every craft carried its own rituals. A potter might whisper an apology to the earth before taking new clay. A jade carver would sprinkle maize flour on his stone, offering a meal to the spirit inside before beginning his labor. Nothing in Venta was purely functional. Even tools bore traces of ceremony. A grinding stone might be engraved with tiny glyphs, a water jar's lip decorated with the subtle curve of a serpent. The Olmecs had no word for art in our sense because art was everywhere, woven into baskets, stamped into textiles hidden beneath floors. Beauty wasn't an addition to life, it was its foundation. Archaeologists have uncovered small caches near the workshops, broken celts, unfinished figurines, flakes of obsidian carefully collected and buried together. These were not trash heaps, but funerals. Every shard carried spirit, and when its work was done, it was returned to the earth like a body. The artisan's world was one of eternal recycling clay, to vessel, to dust, to new clay. They must have seen their own lives reflected in that cycle, a reminder that even creators are temporary. One of the most remarkable crafts was the making of magnetite mirrors. The raw mineral mined from distant mountains arrived as dull gray lumps. But when ground for months on end against a convex mold, it became a flawless mirror, capable of focusing sunlight to ignite fire. To the Olmecs, this was sorcery of the highest order, pulling flame from the sun itself. Such mirrors were mounted on altars or worn as pectorals by priests reflecting not faces, but the invisible. When tilted, they caught both torchlight and stars, turning every ceremony into a dance of shifting brilliance. Imagine standing before a priest at night, his chest mirror flashing like a captured star, his face invisible behind it. It was not merely spectacle, it was philosophy. The divine is not to be seen directly, it is what blinds you in reflection. Venta's workshops also birthed the smallest masterpieces, beads and ear spools no larger than seeds, carved with patterns only visible by touch. Some were shaped like maize kernels, others like jaguar heads or curling flames. When strung together, they made soft music, the rustle of devotion. Wearing them wasn't vanity, it was communion. Each ornament reminded its bearer of the connection between body and cosmos, between labor and life. Trade fed this artistry. Traders paddled in from distant lands, bearing obsidian from the Mexican highlands, shells from the Gulf mica from the Chiapas mountains. The artisans transformed these imports into objects that glowed with local meaning. A single conch shell, once the home of a sea creature, could become a trumpet to summon rain. A sliver of volcanic glass could become a blade to open veins in offering. Every material, no matter how humble, was a doorway between worlds. The workshops weren't isolated from power. Rulers and priests visited often, commissioning objects for ceremonies, inspecting progress, sometimes even performing blessings over new tools. The artisans themselves held ambiguous status, neither common laborers nor elites, but something in between. They were respected, perhaps even feared for their ability to give face to the unseen. In a culture where image equaled presence, to carve a god's likeness was to summon it. It's no wonder some workshops were treated like temples, their floors stained with incense ash and offerings of jade dust. The Olmecs also left traces of experimentation, failed attempts, curious hybrids. One piece, a half-finished figurine, shows a man whose limbs dissolve into serpents. Another depicts a child with a fishtail. These were not mistakes, but meditations on transformation. The artisans were thinkers as much as technicians. Each stroke of the chisel asked a question: what separates one form from another? How far can the human shape stretch before it becomes divine? Even the city itself seemed to emulate their precision. The alignment of buildings, the curvature of canals, the layout of plazas all mirrored the craftsman's eye for symmetry and rhythm. From above, La Venta resembled a colossal artwork, its pyramid a brushstroke of clay, its mosaics the outlines of an unseen face. The artisans didn't just decorate the city, they authored it. Every wall and drain was part of their sculpture, every festival a living exhibition. And yet behind the magnificence lingered humility. The artisans knew their works would be buried, hidden, eroded by rain. They carved not for applause, but for continuity. Theirs was the art of patience, of trust, that beauty mattered even when unseen. In that, they were truer believers than any priest. If La Venta was the temple of the Olmecs, its lifeblood flowed through the rivers. Every morning, as mist lifted from the lagoons, the water came alive with motion canoes, slicing through reflections, paddles dipping in perfect rhythm. These were not fishermen or farmers, but merchants, the quiet voyagers who carried the civilization's breath beyond the horizon. Long before paved roads and caravans, the Olmecs turned rivers into highways. Their sleek canoes, carved from ceiba trunks, could glide from the highland valleys of Puebla to the wide mouth of the Gulf of Mexico. To watch one depart was to witness a ritual of its own. The boatmen knelt at the river's edge, sprinkling maize flour onto the current for luck. The paddle dipped, the hull creaked, and the canoe vanished into a corridor of shimmering green. Each departure tied La Venta to a world far larger than its island of clay. Trade had begun humbly centuries earlier, villages exchanging salt for obsidian cacao for fish. But by La Venta's time, it had become an art, a choreography of exchange stretching hundreds of kilometers. Obsidian from the highlands, jade from Guatemala, iron ore from Oaxaca, shells and pearls from the Gulf, and cacao beans from Chiapas all flowed into the Olmec heartland. In return went textiles, pottery, maize, rubber, and ideas. The Olmecs were the quiet architects of Mesoamerica's first economy. Picture the docks of La Venta on a humid afternoon. The air hums with insects and human chatter. Canoes crowd the shoreline like leaves on water. Traders unload bundles wrapped in woven mats. Blocks of jade glowing through the fibers, obsidian cores that catch the light like black mirrors, dried fish and salt sealed in gourds. Children run barefoot through the shallows, chasing stray shells that tumble from the cargo. Overseers tally goods with cords, and knots an early kind of record-keeping, each knot a promise of value owed. Nearby priests bless the exchange with handfuls of incense. Trade, after all, was sacred. To move goods was to move life itself. The routes were perilous. Some journeys wound through dense jungle alive with insects and jaguars. Others hugged the storm-prone coast. Yet the Olmecs, masters of the river, embraced risk with the calm confidence of those who had learned to negotiate with gods and water alike. Their canoes carried not just cargo, but stories. They brought home tales of mountain people who mined black glass, that cut like lightning of coastal villages, where pearls shimmered inside the mouths of oysters of distant jungles, where jade flowed from the earth like green ice. In every stop, the Olmecs left gifts, small figurines, polished celts, ornaments that bore the unmistakable stamp of their artistry. Through trade, their influence spread like pollen on the wind. You can trace it even now. Olmec-style masks found hundreds of kilometers away, figurines with feline features turning up in villages that never saw La Venta. They didn't conquer, they impressed. Their ideas traveled farther than any army could march. The waterways also carried something less tangible cosmology. Traders brought home not only goods, but new gods, new symbols, new myths. From the highlands came tales of fiery mountains that spat stone. From the coasts, legends of serpents that swallowed the moon. The Olmecs absorbed these stories and reforged them into their own theology, their pantheon expanding like the network of rivers itself. Every exchange was both economic and philosophical, a trade of matter and meaning. By day, the merchants navigated by the river's bends, the leaning of palms, the flight of birds. By night, they steered by the stars, which the priests of La Venta had charted with precision. The Milky Way, seen reflected on the still water, became a map both celestial and terrestrial. They called it the Sky River, believing it mirrored the real rivers below, connecting the living to the gods. To drift beneath those stars, hearing only the slap of paddle and the sigh of jungle wind, must have felt like moving through two worlds at once. Trade also reshaped society. Wealth concentrated in La Venta's hands as foreign goods flowed inward. The rulers wore jade necklaces whose stones came from hundreds of kilometers away. Their priests burned incense in seashell censers that once held creatures from the Caribbean. Commoners might never travel, but they lived surrounded by proof that their world was vast, a world bound together by the soft rhythm of paddles. The merchants themselves occupied a peculiar place in the social order. They were not elites, yet they touched distant worlds that the elites could only imagine. Their knowledge of geography, weather, and languages made them invaluable and a little mysterious. Some, returning from months at sea, brought back more than goods. They carried stories of spirits glimpsed in the waves of dolphins that guided canoes through fog of lightning, striking the same tree twice as an omen. When they returned, the priests listened carefully. To the Olmecs, every voyage was also a spiritual expedition. Rubber was among their prized exports. The Olmecs were the first to harvest and process it, mixing latex from the Castilla elastica tree with the juice of morning glories to create a resilient bouncing material. They used it to waterproof canoes, to seal pots, and most famously, to make the heavy rubber balls used in their ritual games. Those balls traded widely, carried the Olmec presence into lands that had never seen their pyramids. Every bounce in a distant court echoed the heartbeat of La Venta. And what of the sea? The Olmecs were no strangers to it. Their rivers opened into the Gulf, and from there, daring traders hugged the coastlines, their canoes bobbing in the swell. They followed the curve of the Yucatan, perhaps even reaching the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, exchanging goods with people who spoke different tongues, but recognized the same symbols of power, jade jaguar's maze. For those who ventured out to sea was both peril and promise, a shimmering road beneath a ceiling of clouds. They prayed to it with the same reverence they gave the rivers, offering shells, feathers, and blood before each departure. The ocean was the final god, vast and unpredictable. At night, when the traders camped along the shore, they built small fires and listened to the endless hush of waves. In the dark, the water glowed faintly with phosphorescent plankton like liquid stars. They told stories of the homeland of the Great Pyramid rising above the wetlands of the ruler who could command rain with a gesture of the canals that sang during storms. And perhaps, as the surf whispered, they realized that they too were part of something monumental, a network of human current flowing across the ancient world. Back in Venta, the docks awaited their return. The people would gather at sunrise, scanning the river's bend for the first glint of paddles. When the canoes appeared, the city came alive. Drums rolled, children shouted, priests offered thanks. The traders unloaded their cargo onto the clay shore, and with it, the pulse of distant lands entered once more into the Olmec heart. In those moments, Venta ceased to be an island. It became the center of a living web that spanned jungles, mountains, and seas, a civilization connected not by empire, but by motion, by exchange, by trust in the river's eternal flow. There is a hush that falls in a workshop when the stone begins to speak. The Olmecs believed jade was not a material, but a presence, a cool living essence drawn from the bones of the earth. When struck, it rang faintly, a clear bell-like tone, and they said that was its soul. In Venta, the city of clay and God's jade became the most eloquent language of all the voice through which mortals could address eternity. Everywhere the light caught it. In the sun, it gleamed like water trapped in solid form. In the shade, it seemed to glow from within an ember of the world's first dawn. To touch it was to touch something immortal. The Olmec word for jade, if we could hear it, likely meant not stone, but something closer to breath, spirit, or heart. In their myths, life itself was shaped from this green radiance, and even after death, the soul returned to it like moisture evaporating back to sky. The jade came from far away, deep in the mountains of Guatemala's Motagua Valley. Traders traveled weeks to reach the quarries, hacking at the cliffs, where veins of translucent green ran through the rock like frozen rivers. They carried it home through jungles and over passes, each boulder a burden of the sacred. In Venta, only the most skilled artisans dared to touch it. They worked in quiet, their tools, simple sand string drills, patience. It could take months to polish a single bead to perfection. They said jade resisted the unworthy. It cracked if handled without reverence. From their hands emerged objects that seemed to hum with meaning. There were axes, celts so finely shaped they looked more ceremonial than practical, their edges glinting like green lightning. There were pendants carved into the forms of maize stalks, frogs and human jaguar hybrids, masks with serene downturned mouths, and almond eyes, faces of gods, ancestors, or perhaps both. The Olmecs wore jade not for beauty, but for connection. To place it against the skin was to feel the pulse of the universe. Jade was also the currency of devotion. Every offering buried beneath Venta's plazas shimmered with it. In one pit, archaeologists uncovered more than 400 jade objects, some arranged in patterns, others deliberately broken. Breaking them wasn't desecration, it was liberation. The stone spirit had to be released, set free, to join the gods below. You can imagine the moment priests kneeling in the humid dark, holding each polished piece to the torchlight one last time, before striking it with a hammerstone, the sound ringing like a small, perfect death. The color alone carried layers of symbolism. Green was the hue of new maize shoots, of rain-soaked leaves, of water and sunlight. It was growth incarnate. Yet in twilight, jade deepened toward blue, the color of rivers and the underworld. The Olmecs saw no contradiction. To them, life and death were shades of the same continuum, two reflections in the same gem. A jade mask, placed on a corpse's face, didn't mourn, it completed the circle. The body returned to the earth. The spirit rejoined the eternal green. Rulers used jade as both emblem and armor. Necklaces of massive beads framed their chests. Ear spools the size of fists gleamed in their lobes. In ceremonies, the ruler's voice would echo through conch shell trumpets, the sound resonating against the jade, adorning him a duet of breath and stone. He wasn't just human then. He was the embodiment of order, the visible proof that harmony between earth and sky was possible. The Olmecs didn't separate politics from poetry. The same jewel could declare sovereignty and sanctity. Among the most mysterious artifacts are the votive axes, slender jade blades with no sharp edge, often engraved with hybrid figures, half man, half spirit. Scholars call them axes of transformation. Some show a human face emerging from a cleft, others a jaguar's mouth devouring or birthing a person. Each one was a statement in metaphysics, carved in the vocabulary of green light, that every living thing contained another self waiting to be revealed. They were mirrors of faith as much as symbols of power. There was also music in jade. When struck gently, large pieces produced a resonant tone, like wind through a flute. Some priests used them as instruments during ceremonies, arranging polished celts in sequences that, when tapped, created melodies meant to summon rain or echo thunder. Imagine that sound at dusk, the pyramid glowing in amber light, the air heavy with incense, and from the plaza floor, a chorus of stone voices singing the sky awake. The artisans must have known the intimacy of their task. They sat for hours, shaping something that would likely be buried unseen by human eyes. Yet they labored anyway, because the gods saw everything beneath the earth. When they drilled holes through beads, they called them breathways, believing air would pass through and keep the object alive. When they polished a face, they said they were giving it its final exhale. In every gesture was tenderness, a strange, serene reverence for matter itself. Even trade in jade carried ritual weight. Merchants traveling with the greenstone were bound by taboos. They had to abstain from meat and salt wash in rivers before dawn and keep silence during parts of their journey. To lose a piece was a cosmic offense, not just an economic one. Some even carried small effigies of frogs, creatures of both land and water, as charms to guard against misfortune. The trade routes glimmered with this quiet piety. Every transaction was a prayer disguised as commerce. In time, the allure of jade transcended the Olmec heartland. Across Mesoamerica, cultures that had never seen La Venta began carving in its style human faces, with feline grace masks, with calm, eternal smiles. The jade language spread farther than the Olmec tongue itself, enduring long after the cities fell silent. Later, Maya kings would still bury jade in their tombs. Aztec priests would still whisper to it. The Olmecs had set a precedent not only in art, but in how humanity might speak to eternity through beauty, through patience, through green stone that remembered sunlight. By the time La Venta's pyramid touched the clouds, the Olmecs had begun shaping something even more enduring than stone or jade. They had already carved gods from mountains and coaxed crops from mud. Now, they turned inward, attempting to carve meaning itself, to trap time, thought, and memory in marks that could outlive breath. In this quiet revolution, they gave the Americas their first whispers of writing their first mathematics, their first organized way of measuring the endless conversation between sky and earth. It began perhaps with the sky watchers, the priests who slept little and stared long. They had already noticed that the sun did not rise in quite the same place each day, that the stars turned in patterns, repeating every year that the floods came not by chance, but by rhythm. To track such rhythms, they needed symbols, not stories, numbers, not hunches. And so, on clay tablets, on jade celts, on the faces of altars, they began scratching the seeds of abstraction. The earliest Olmec symbols are simple dots and bars, sometimes paired with heads of animals or geometric signs. A single dot meant 1, a bar 5, a shell perhaps 0 or completion. It was not yet a full language, more like music notation for the cosmos. But even that small step changed everything. Time could now be counted, not merely felt. The rains could be predicted. The festivals scheduled the deaths and births of rulers aligned with celestial events. Order, the true religion of the Olmecs, had found its alphabet. In the plazas of Venta, ceremonies grew increasingly synchronized with this calendar. The city's layout itself reflected mathematical devotion. The main avenue tilted 8 degrees west of north, aligning perfectly with the setting sun on specific dates that likely marked the agricultural cycle. The people didn't separate astronomy from architecture. Their temples were calendars made solid. To walk the main axis was to walk through the year. Priests became mathematicians, though they would never have used the word. They spoke, instead of cycles, the 260-day sacred count, echoing human gestation, and the 365-day solar cycle of the maize and the rains. Together, they formed a wheel of time that turned endlessly, never beginning or ending, like the rivers they worshipped. To be born on a certain day was to inherit its character, jaguar, or serpent water, or fire, east or west. Destiny itself had coordinates now. Imagine a dawn festival dedicated to the turn of one of these cycles. The pyramid glows amber as the first light strikes its fluted sides. The priests descend the steps, carrying bundles of bark paper and brushes made from reeds. On smooth slabs of clay, they paint signs, dots bars, and stylized faces, each representing the passage of days. The crowd watches in reverent silence. Somewhere among them stands a child who will grow up never knowing a world without written signs, a world where memory depends only on voice. The future is being written quite literally at his feet. Among the most haunting of these early records is the Cascajal block, discovered millennia later in Veracruz, a slab of serpentine covered with 62 glyphs, some resembling insects, plants, and abstract forms, others still undecipherable. Scholars debate its meaning. Is it a list of offerings, a royal decree, a poem for the gods? Whatever it says, it whispers of something monumental, thought made permanent. The Olmecs had crossed the threshold from sound to sign. Their monuments also began to carry inscriptions, numerical notations, perhaps dates or names. Stelae at San Lorenzo and La Venta bear rows of symbols framing the images of rulers and gods, as if to say, this happened then. History was being born one carved line at a time. Even if we can't yet read their words, we can feel their intent to fix a moment against the river of forgetting. Mathematics followed naturally from this urge to measure. To design their precise terraces and drains, the Olmecs must have understood proportion and geometry. The spacing of their altars suggests a base 20 counting system, the same that would later flourish among the Maya. They could divide land, allocate resources, and calculate alignments with eerie accuracy. A civilization that began with mud and maize had become one that measured the heavens with lines in the dust. These advances were not the work of scholars in isolation. They were community projects, rituals of intellect. Each evening, as the sun dipped beyond the wetlands, the priest astronomers would climb their observation mounds. They brought small bowls of water and placed them on the clay surface to mirror the sky. When a star's reflection touched the bowl's rim, they marked the time with a notch on a stick. Night after night, notch after notch, the patterns emerged. Venus, the Pleiades, the slow breathing of the seasons. From those reflections was born the architecture of every future Mesoamerican city. Even common people felt the power of these new symbols. Clay tokens bearing dots and lines were placed in graves, perhaps as time markers for the journey of the dead. Farmers consulted priests who read the heavens to choose planting days. Children learned to count by arranging maize kernels in groups of 5, mimicking the dots and bars carved on temple stones. Knowledge was trickling downward, democratized by necessity. The cosmos belonged to everyone. Writing also changed memory. Myths, once told by firelight, could now be encoded in carvings, retold without distortion or with new authority. A ruler's deeds could be eternal, his image paired with glyphs, proclaiming divine lineage. The Olmec elites, always attuned to symbolism, surely recognized the political potential of literacy. To control the written sign was to control truth. But for all its propaganda, writing also preserved wonder. The same glyphs that glorified rulers also recorded the cycles of Venus, the dates of eclipses, the songs of rain. Their inscriptions, though sparse, read like love letters to time. From this foundation, the later civilizations of Mesoamerica would bloom. The Zapotec scribes, the Maya codex painters, the astronomer priests of Teotihuacan. All of them would owe their first vocabulary to the Olmecs. Even their word for day would trace its root to these early signs scratched into jade and clay. The Olmecs were the ones who realized that time could be drawn, that the universe had grammar. History tends to remember monuments, the heads of stone, the pyramids of clay, the glint of jade. But the real story of the Olmecs unfolded in the humbler rhythm of everyday life in the villages and courtyards where people woke, worked, laughed, and slept under the endless sigh of the tropical wind. The pyramids were only possible because thousands of hands calloused and sunburned believed in the worth of their own small labors. To understand the Olmecs fully, one must leave the plazas of La Venta and walk down to the lower terraces to the kitchens, fields, and hammocks where the heart of civilization beat quietly beneath the palms. Morning began before dawn. The air was cool for perhaps 20 minutes, a brief mercy before the heat set in. Smoke rose from thatched roofs as women kindled fires with resin and dry maize husks. The smell of roasting corn drifted through the mist, mixing with the sweet metallic scent of wet earth. In the courtyards, dogs stretched and yawned, chickens rustled in reed cages, and babies wailed with hunger. By the time the sun's first rays reached the pyramid above the city was already in motion. A typical home was simple, but ingenious. A rectangular hut of woven reeds, plastered with mud set on a small mound to resist flooding. The roof thatched with palm or grass sloped sharply so rain would slide off in silver sheets. Inside, life was compact and communal. Hammocks swung between wooden posts. Clay pots lined the walls, some filled with grain, others with cool river water. The hearth was the center, the sacred heart of the household. Every meal, every conversation, every story began there. A woman stirring maize porridge with a wooden paddle was not merely cooking. She was continuing a ritual older than the pyramids. Breakfast was humble tortillas, or tamales made from ground maize, sometimes flavored with beans, chili, or cacao. The grinding itself was a labor of patience, a rhythmic scraping on the metate, the stone tool that turned kernels to paste. The sound echoed across the settlement like a heartbeat, each scrape a measure of time. Archaeologists call it the music of work, and in those slow, steady movements, generations learn discipline, endurance, and love. Outside men prepared for the fields. They carried wooden digging sticks, tipped with sharpened stone, their only plows. Some went to tend maize, others to check the canals that nourished their chinampas, raised gardens surrounded by shimmering water. Farming was both science and prayer. The soil, black and generous, demanded gratitude. Before planting, farmers sprinkled a few kernels as offerings to the rain gods, muttering the names of ancestors who first learned to coax life from mud. Each seed was a conversation between the living and the dead. Children worked alongside their parents, learning by imitation. A boy would follow his father down the canal banks, helping clear reeds, while a girl carried water jugs or fetched firewood. There were no schools as we know them, but education happened everywhere through stories, through song, through the repeated gestures of survival. In the evenings, when the work was done, elders told tales around the fire, how the jaguar gave humans their first maize, how the rivers spoke when the world was young, how people must remember to live gently, or the gods would withdraw their favor. Myths were not bedtime stories. They were instructions for staying alive. Every season brought its own rhythm. The rainy months transformed the landscape into a mirror sky and water indistinguishable. Canoes replaced footpaths. Children splashed in the flooded courtyards, their laughter rising above the drone of frogs. The dry season hardened the soil and thickened the air with dust and smoke. During those months, people repaired roofs, burned fields for new planting, and gathered under the stars to celebrate the survival of another cycle. The pattern repeated endlessly: labor feast, repair, rest. Time itself felt circular, like the spiral motifs carved into the city's monuments. Trade fairs brought bursts of color and noise. Farmers arrived with baskets of maize and beans. Hunters brought pelts and dried meat. Artisans sold beads, pots, and figurines. The market was part festival, part negotiation, part social theater. News traveled here faster than any canoe. Who was marrying whom? Which village had been flooded? What omens the priests had read in the stars, all exchanged between bowls of steaming maize beer and good-natured haggling. In those plazas of barter, the vastness of the Olmec world condensed into human scale. Family life followed the rhythm of the earth. Children were born at home, delivered by midwives who doubled as healers and sages. Illness was treated with herbs, smoke, and prayer. Balance, not conquest, was the goal. Women held quiet authority, keepers of food, fertility, and continuity. They wove cotton into simple tunics, their looms strung between trees. Patterns repeated across generations: zigzags for water spirals, for life, triangles for mountains. Each thread was a history lesson, a soft version of the cosmic diagrams carved in stone. Art and faith wove through domestic life as seamlessly as through the grand temples. Clay figurines of women babies and animals filled the homes, guardians, teachers, companions. During storms, people lit incense before them, asking the spirits of ancestors to shield their walls. Children were taught to bow to the fire each morning and to the moon each night. Gratitude was the Olmec creed. Gratitude to the maize that fed them, to the rivers that carried their reflection, to the ancestors whose bones enriched the soil. The Olmec diet was simple, but abundant: maize, beans, squash, chili peppers, cacao, avocados, and fish from the canals. Occasionally, there was turkey deer or turtle. Everything was cooked, slowly boiled, roasted, or wrapped in leaves, and steamed in underground pits. The meals weren't rushed. Eating itself was an act of worship. Each bite reaffirmed the bond between body and land. Even the humblest family could point to the horizon and say, "We live inside the gods' generosity." At night, the village transformed again. The air cooled, fireflies blinked among the reeds, and the sounds of frogs and crickets became a lullaby. From the high pyramid above, torchlight flickered faintly, a reminder of the sacred city's watchful gaze. Down below, families lay in their hammocks, children falling asleep, to the rhythmic creak of ropes and the soft murmur of parents trading stories. Somewhere, a distant drum echoed a priest calling to the heavens, but here on the ground, the gods felt close enough to touch. There were hardships, of course, fevers, floods, and loss, but they were accepted as part of the same cycle that brought rain and birth. To an Olmec, suffering was not punishment, but transformation. When the river took a field, another would be cleared. When a child died, the family carved a small figurine in its likeness and buried it under the house, ensuring its spirit would still guard the home. Grief was folded into daily life, like salt into dough, necessary, invisible, and sustaining. In the soft glow of dawn over La Venta, life divided itself into three realms: the domestic, the divine, and the powerful. And between them walked those rare souls who could slip from one world to another. The women who kept the hearths, the shamans who bridged heaven and earth, and the rulers who tried somehow to contain both within their flesh. To understand the Olmecs, you must stand in that triangle where birth, trance, and command were not separate callings, but variations of the same sacred role to keep the world in balance. Women were its quiet foundation. In a culture that carved gods with jaguar fangs and built pyramids from clay, it was the women who ensured that life continued at all. They controlled the alchemy of maize and fire, the mysterious chemistry that transformed seed into bread and blood into children. In the mornings, you might see them kneeling at the hearth, grinding maize with hypnotic rhythm, the steady scrape of stone on stone echoing across courtyards. To outsiders, it was a mundane sound. To the Olmecs, it was cosmic percussion, the echo of creation itself. The first gods had, after all, ground their own bones into flour to shape humanity. Every tortilla was a reenactment of that first sacrifice. Women oversaw the home, but also the unseen. They tended household altars, buried offerings beneath the thresholds, whispered to the spirits of ancestors. Some served as midwives, half healers, half priestesses, who sang the child into the world and chanted over the umbilical cord as though sealing a pact with the gods. Birth was not simply biological, it was ceremonial. The newborn was presented to the hearth fire, its forehead touched with maize dough, its first cry greeted as a promise that the world would go on one more day. If the women were the earth, the shamans were its lightning, unpredictable, dazzling necessary. They lived on the edges of society, in huts surrounded by strange herbs, in caves heavy with bats, or in remote patches of jungle where the air shimmered with both humidity and superstition. People came to them with fevers, with bad dreams, with fields gone barren. The shamans did not cure in the way of doctors. They negotiated. They entered trances, breathed smoke from burning herbs, and spoke in voices that weren't entirely their own. In those moments, they said they became jaguars, or serpents, slipping across the veil between the living and the divine. What the priests controlled through ceremony, the shamans commanded through chaos. They were feared and respected equally. Some wore necklaces of animal teeth, others masks carved from gourds or jade. They kept collections of bones and feather stones that glowed faintly in moonlight seeds that rattled with invisible spirits. In the humid dark of the rainforest, one could believe such things held power. Their rituals were not grand public spectacles like the ones atop the pyramid. They were intimate, terrifying, filled with the scent of blood and flowers. They healed cursed predicted storms and claimed to speak with the ancestors buried beneath the city. The rulers, meanwhile, stood at the intersection of both these worlds, half household patriarchs, half divine mediators, often guided by the shamans, and upheld by the women who birthed their heirs. Their legitimacy was less about lineage than about balance. An Olmec ruler had to embody both the fertility of the earth and the ferocity of the jaguar. He had to feed his people and impress his gods, both with equal ceremony. His power was theatrical, displayed through costume ritual and the manipulation of cosmic imagery. Archaeologists believe the colossal heads represent these rulers immortalized in basalt, each face distinct lips, full eyes, heavy with something between vigilance and exhaustion. Their helmets may not be armor, but ritual headdresses, symbols of authority derived from the ball game itself, a microcosm of cosmic struggle. When a ruler appeared before his people, painted in red and black jade, glinting at his throat, smoke swirling around his silhouette, he was not a man performing divinity. He was divinity performing humanity. His palace was both home and temple. Courtyards rang with the sound of music and murmured prayer. Servants swept floors of colored clay, polished jade ornaments, and prepared offerings of food and flowers. In one chamber, a shaman might be chanting over a bowl of water, reading omens in its ripples. In another, the ruler's consort, queen priestess, or both, sat weaving her loom, strung with cotton dyed in sacred hues. Together, they formed a partnership as old as civilization itself, the shaman king and the earth mother queen, their union symbolic of the balance between creation and control. Power for the Olmecs was never purely human. It was borrowed from the gods, and it demanded repayment. Each season brought ceremonies reaffirming this debt. During the great festivals of La Venta, the ruler presided over public offerings, bloodletting rituals, and dances of transformation. He might pierce his own flesh with obsidian blades, letting his blood drip into the soil as a renewal of the cosmic contract. Around him, shamans drummed and chanted the rhythm rising until the entire plaza trembled. To the crowd, it was not a performance, but a literal negotiation with the forces that kept the rivers flowing and the maize growing. The ruler bled, so the people would not have to. The women watched from the terraces, their faces illuminated by torchlight. They were not passive observers. Their prayers and songs shaped the ritual's success. Some legends suggest that after such ceremonies, the ruler would retreat into seclusion, fasting and meditating for days, while women tended fires in his stead. In those silent nights, the city was held together by invisible labor women, grinding maize, feeding children, mending nets, each act a reaffirmation of order. Even in death, the hierarchy endured. Elite burials in La Venta show couples interred side by side, the ruler with his jade regalia, the woman with jewelry and household offerings, grinding stones, cooking pots, figurines. To modern eyes, the division looks mundane. To the Olmecs, it was metaphysical. He ruled the skies, she ruled the hearth, and together they ruled eternity. Beneath this stratified order, social bonds remained surprisingly elastic. Power was respected, but not entirely feared. Commoners saw in their leaders not distant monarchs, but conduits, people who could keep the balance between rain and drought, abundance and famine. The ruler's authority depended on success. A year of bad floods, a failed harvest, or an eclipse mispredicted could erode faith quickly. Then the shaman's whispers would grow bolder, and new faces might rise from the terraces. Olmec politics, like its rivers, always moved in cycles. In quieter moments, when no ceremonies shook the air and the pyramid stood wrapped in moonlight, life across La Venta seemed perfectly balanced. Women rocked infants beside glowing hearths. Shamans traced constellations in bowls of water. Rulers watched the sky from their terraces, wondering if the gods still approved. Somewhere far below, in the dark earth, beneath the plazas, buried offerings gleamed faintly, jade, serpentine, and obsidian, the old promises still waiting to be honored. It was a society built not on dominance, but on dialogue between genders, between castes, between worlds. Everyone from queen to fisherman had a role in maintaining the conversation between life and the divine. The women spoke through sustenance, the shamans through trance, the rulers through ritual. Together, they composed a harmony the world would not hear again for centuries. The gods had gone quiet. For centuries, the Olmecs had believed themselves in rhythm with the sky, their cities breathing with the same calm pulse as the rivers. But around 400 BC, the music faltered. It began, as ruin often does, with the earth beneath their feet. Far to the west, the mountains muttered. The Tuxtla volcanoes silent, since the dawn of their myths awoke in fits of fire. At first it was distant thunder, then a red glow on the horizon. Days later, the sky began to darken. Ash drifted east across the Gulf lowlands, falling like gray rain upon maize fields and temple roofs. At dawn, the sun rose blood orange through the haze, and people whispered that the god's hearth had cracked. The ash poisoned the world gently, almost politely. It coated leaves and choked rivers. Fish died first, floating belly up in the stagnant canals. Then the maize withered its green, turning dull, its roots suffocating in soil turned acidic. The Olmecs, who had mastered mud and flood, found themselves powerless against dust. The priests burned more incense, the farmers dug deeper ditches, the shamans cut their arms and spilled blood into the canals, but the rains did not come. When they did, they came all at once. Storms rose from the sea like unleashed gods. Lightning split the forests. Rain hammered the clay terraces until they bled back into the rivers. Canals that once whispered with calm precision now roared with fury. The waterways that had sustained the Olmec heartland turned against it, bursting their banks, drowning crops and houses alike. Whole terraces collapsed, sliding into the valleys with the slow grace of dying giants. The pyramid at Venta stood firm, but its base was ringed by water. The sacred island was becoming an island again. The aftermath was quieter, more desperate. Crops failed in the second year. Maize harvests shrank. Storage jars emptied. The air that once smelled of roasting corn now carried the sour tang of decay. Families began to leave the lower terraces, moving to higher ground. Others stayed clinging to the belief that the gods were only testing them. But doubt spread faster than hunger. The old order depended on balance rulers who could command rain priests, who could read the stars, shamans who could soothe the earth's temper. Now none of them could explain why the rivers rebelled or the heavens fell silent. The calendar still turned, but the seasons no longer obeyed it. The very mathematics that had once made them masters of time became a cruel joke. With famine came fear, and with fear came factions. In San Lorenzo, already a shadow of its former glory, rival priesthoods accused one another of angering the gods. Offerings multiplied jade, obsidian, even human lives. Sanctuary plazas that once echoed with music filled instead with smoke and screams. At Venta, the great altars were repurposed into stages for accusation and sacrifice. The people knelt in the mud before rulers who bled themselves in public, slicing their ears and thighs with obsidian blades as if pain itself could coax mercy from the sky. But mercy did not come. The heavens seemed to have moved on. Volcanic ash gave way to rising tides. Along the Gulf Coast, the sea crept inland, swallowing marshes and fields alike. Storm surges swept away villages built too close to the water. Fishermen returned to find their canals filled with silt and their nets tangled with the dead. The smell of rot clung to the wind. In the highlands, refugees spoke of lands shaking of fire raining from the mountains. The gods are walking again, they said, and they are angry. The rulers of Venta responded with architecture, their language of control. They built new walls to channel the floods, new embankments to contain the sea. But the clay cracked under pressure, and each repair lasted a little less. The old engineers had designed their world for cooperation with nature, not combat against it. The Olmecs for the first time fought the land they had once loved. The psychological toll was worse. Priests, who could no longer guarantee rain, lost their aura of divinity. Farmers began to question whether the colossal heads still protected them or simply watched their suffering. Some defaced the old idols, chipping at the basalt faces that had once inspired awe. Others buried them in ritual farewell, turning the act of destruction into ceremony. The gods were not being killed, they were being retired. The people had decided to start over somewhere else with new protectors. Within the cities, disorder grew like mold. Elites quarreled over dwindling resources. Artisans left their workshops. Temples became refuges for the displaced. The plazas filled not with dancers, but with tents and grieving mothers. Children born in this generation would never remember the golden age of San Lorenzo or La Venta. They would know only survival. The grand symmetry of Olmec design fractured into improvisation. What had once been civilization began to look like endurance. There were still moments of beauty amid the ruin. One chronicler, if the carved stelae can be trusted, speaks of a festival held during the last harvest, before the famine deepened. The people gathered lighting torches around the flooded pyramid, singing the old hymns one last time. As the moon rose, the water surrounding the city reflected the flames, turning the island into a floating lantern. The priests declared it a sign of rebirth. But when dawn came, the fires were drowned by rain. By 400 BC, the heartland that had once fed half a continent was breaking apart, literally and spiritually. San Lorenzo's terraces collapsed into swamp. La Venta's foundations eroded. Smaller settlements vanished entirely beneath silt. The survivors fled inland toward the higher ridges and the promise of drier soil. They carried with them fragments of sculpture, bundles of seeds, and the memory of balance. The first civilization of the Americas had met the oldest adversary of all the earth itself. The Olmecs had always seen nature as a partner. Now it had become their executioner and heir. Yet even as their sanctuaries turned to battlegrounds, they responded not with fury, but with ritual grace, burying their monuments, sealing their mosaics, whispering apologies to the soil that had betrayed them. In the ashes of their collapse, they performed their final act of devotion to return everything they had borrowed. And somewhere beyond the storms, in a valley untouched by the flood, a handful of refugees knelt before a new altar of packed clay. They placed a single jade bead in the center, covered it with earth, and whispered an old prayer. May the world remember how we once listened. Part 19. Buried Giants. When the sky finally cleared and the floods receded, the Olmec heartland lay silent. The once green plains of San Lorenzo and La Venta were streaked with gray mud, their canals twisted and lifeless. The people who had not fled wandered through a landscape that felt both familiar and foreign. The jungle was returning. Vines crawled up the faces of temples' roots, coiled around stairways, and frogs sang in courtyards that had once echoed with drums. The age of the Olmecs was ending not in conquest or flame, but in exhaustion. They could have abandoned it all without a word, but that was not their way. The people who had built mountains from clay did not simply walk away, they closed things. Theirs was a culture of ceremony, and even collapse would be conducted with grace. The final generations of La Venta became undertakers of their own civilization, turning cities into shrines, monuments into prayers, and ruin into ritual. The colossal heads were the first to be addressed. For centuries, they had stood in plazas, watching festivals, councils, and offerings. Now, cracked by rain and half submerged in silt, they seemed almost weary. One by one, the people laid them down, carefully, deliberately facing the earth. Some were buried beneath new layers of clay, others encircled with offerings of jade and obsidian. The act was not vandalism, it was farewell. The kings they represented had long since joined the ancestors, and the people in their sorrow returned the stone giants to the womb of the world that birthed them. Around the plazas, altars were dismantled, and mosaics buried beneath fresh floors of colored clay. Excavations show rows of serpentine tiles still aligned in geometric perfection, sealed forever under meters of earth. To modern eyes, it looks like desecration. To the Olmecs, it was devotion, the final stage of worship. What had once belonged to the living was now offered to the underworld gods. The cycle was complete. In San Lorenzo, the ritual was darker. Their old statues were smashed, perhaps in anger, perhaps in grief. The heads of rulers were defaced, lips split by hammer blows, eyes gouged out. The carvings that survived bear the marks of both reverence and rebellion, scratches that could be either the hands of mourners or the fury of those who felt betrayed. Civilization itself seemed to be on trial. The gods had failed to protect the land, the rulers had failed to appease them, and the people were left to decide how to close the book without tearing it. Yet even amid ruin, beauty persisted. The last artisans of Venta produced smaller works, jade pendants, clay figurines, delicate, intimate pieces that could be carried rather than displayed. Their art turned inward, away from monuments and toward memory. Perhaps they sensed that these were keepsakes for descendants who would never know the city's grandeur. Each bead, each carving, was a portable archive of what it had meant to be Olmec. The Great Pyramid of Venta, once the beacon of a continent, began to sink. Floodwaters gnawed at its fluted sides, washing away its bright pigments. The priests, seeing the inevitable, held one last ceremony at its base. They dug a wide pit and filled it with offerings, celts, figurines, polished stones, fragments of shells, and finally the ashes of their own altars. Then they sealed it with layers of colored clay, red over yellow, over white, symbolizing blood, earth, and spirit. When the rains returned, the pit vanished beneath the surface, hidden like a heartbeat. Some of the survivors drifted back after the storms, drawn by memory or guilt. They found the old cities uninhabitable, mosquito-ridden, half-submerged, but they still brought offerings. They lit fires on the mounds, sang the old songs, and poured maize beer onto the soil. These were acts less of worship than of remembrance gestures to soothe the restless spirits of the land. And then they, too, departed, leaving the ashes warm and the stones whispering. In time, the jungle reclaimed everything. The plazas became ponds. Trees burst through terraces. Jaguars padded silently across what had been sanctuaries, their golden eyes reflecting torchlight from no longer living hands. The rivers, fickle as ever, rewrote their paths through the valley, covering temples with layers of silt so deep that the earth itself became an archive. The colossal heads slept beneath that weight, dreaming in basalt. Archaeologists centuries later would uncover them and marvel at their preservation, the deliberate symmetry of their burial, the care with which they had been hidden. It was not neglect that saved them, but reverence. The Olmecs had entombed their own past to protect it from time, as though they trusted that someone someday would remember. The final vision of Venta must have been haunting. The pyramid still stood half drowned in mist, its silhouette reflected in flooded fields. The air smelled of wet clay and smoke from the last fires. On the terraces, the few remaining families packed their belongings, clay pots, woven mats, bundles of maize, and pushed their canoes into the current. They didn't look back often. But if they had, they would have seen their city glowing faintly in the dawn, the colossal heads lying at rest, like sleeping ancestors, the water lapping gently against the edges of the sacred mounds. The storm had passed, but it had taken more than lives. It had taken certainty. What remained was faith reduced to its simplest form, the belief that even endings could be sacred. And so the Olmecs buried their giants and moved on, trusting the rivers to guard their memory. In the centuries to come, new peoples would wander into this region and find strange hills where no hills should be stones carved with human faces, staring from the mud fragments of jade glimmering in the sunlight. They would invent stories to explain them, legends of titans, gods, and lost kingdoms. They would not know those stories were true. The Olmecs had disappeared, but they had done so with elegance, turning their fall into ceremony and their ruins into scripture. Beneath the roots of the jungle, the buried giants waited patient, unblinking, unforgotten, dreaming of the day when the world would uncover their faces and remember the first people who learned how to end with grace. They did not vanish. They scattered. When La Venta and San Lorenzo sank back into the marshes, survivors poled their canoes inland and upland, carrying with them fragments of idols, sacks of maize seed, and the last songs of the old tongue. Across the Gulf lowlands, small villages appeared along the ridges like constellations forming from a broken star. Out of ruin, new names were spoken, but the rhythm of the Olmec heart still pulsed beneath them. These refugees built smaller temples on higher ground. Gone were the monumental heads and massive terraces, but the spirit of symmetry, the sense of sacred geometry endured. In the valleys of Veracruz and the isthmus of Tehuantepec, they re-established settlements where floods could no longer reach. One of these would become Tres Zapotes, the final flicker of the Olmec light and the cradle of something new, the Epi-Olmec, the bridge between worlds. The landscape was changing. The coastlines had shifted after centuries of storms, the air clearer, the soil thinner. The people who built Tres Zapotes learned to live differently, planting cacao and maize on terraces, digging wells instead of canals, shaping smaller shrines of stone instead of clay. But they did not forget. The old gods of rain and jaguar and serpent still watched, carved now in humbler reliefs. Even as they spoke new dialects, the cadence of their prayers carried the same melody that had once echoed through La Venta's plazas. Archaeologists call this phase Epi-Olmec, literally after the Olmecs. But to those who lived it, there was no after. They were simply continuing adapting. They inherited the bones of a vanished civilization and refleshed them in a leaner form. Where their ancestors had built mountains, they now built meaning. And in the shaded courtyards of Tres Zapotes, someone began scratching signs on stone lines and curls that would become the earliest true writing of the Americas. The most haunting of these inscriptions survives on a slab now called Stela C. It shows a ruler, stoic and adorned, gazing outward, while symbols cluster around him, glyphs, that scholars would one day realize mark a date, September 3rd, 32nd BC. It is the earliest precisely recorded moment in the Western Hemisphere. The Olmec genius for tracking time had endured through disaster, and here it was stone proof that memory could outlast catastrophe. The rivers had buried their cities, but not their calendars. This bridge generation carried more than words. They carried forms. Their artisans continued to carve jade and obsidian, though now traded north and south across a continent of rising nations. Their designs fanged deities, flame-eyed serpents, human faces emerging from cave mouths appear in distant lands that would one day be called Oaxaca, Chiapas, and Guatemala. A pot found in Monte Alban bears an Olmec-style mask. A jade figurine, unearthed in early Maya territory, smiles with the same downturned mouth as those once buried in La Venta. The symbols had walked farther than their makers. In the valleys of Oaxaca, the Zapotecs were already learning to carve their own temples. They borrowed the Olmec's compass of the cosmos, the four directions, the sacred axis, the alignment of pyramids with the sun's path. Their capital, Monte Alban, would rise on a flattened hilltop, an echo of San Lorenzo's engineered plateau, but grander, drier, more enduring. The concept had migrated whole to rule, was to build on height between earth and sky. Farther east in the jungles that would become the Maya heartland, the echoes deepened. Early Maya priests inherited the Olmec calendar wheels and transformed them into vast systems of numeration, intertwining 260-day ritual counts with 365-day solar cycles. The glyphs of the Epi-Olmec rounded expressive filled with breath evolved into the first true Maya script. Even the jaguar returned reborn as Balam, the royal title of kings. Every civilization that followed wore a fragment of the Olmec soul, like a pendant carved from ancestral jade. Zapotes itself thrived quietly for centuries. It never reached the scale of Venta, but it was a beacon of continuity, a city of scribes and traders, where the descendants of those who buried the colossal heads learned to count to write to measure again. Around their plazas, new stelae rose marked with numbers and faces instead of gods. The colossal heads were gone, but the obsession with recording identity remained. A ruler's visage carved in basalt was no longer a god's likeness. It was biography, the emergence of history from myth. The Epi-Olmec world became a crossroads. To the north, new peoples traded salt and obsidian. To the south, highland merchants brought feathers cacao and tales of volcanoes that smoked like the old Tuxtlas. Language mingled gods, merged calendars, multiplied. The Olmec gift, the idea that the world could be mapped, measured, mirrored, was spreading across the hemisphere. Each culture translated it into its own accent, but the syntax was unmistakable. Even as their numbers dwindled, the descendants of the Olmecs retained one unshakable habit they built in alignment with the stars. The plazas of Zapotes point toward the same celestial markers as Venta once did. The night sky remained their scripture. When the Pleiades rose, they planted maize. When Venus glowed as morning star, they celebrated renewal. They had lost their cities, but not their calendar, their monuments, but not their mathematics. By the first centuries, BC new powers would overshadow them. In central Mexico, early builders were raising platforms at what would become Teotihuacan. To the south, Zapotec stonemasons were carving step temples and tombs. But beneath their progress, the Olmec foundation persisted the blueprints of measurement, the memory of water control, the ritual architecture of symmetry. The hilltops and highlands of Mesoamerica thrummed with the distant rhythm of a civilization that refused to die completely. And if you listen closely to those hills today, where the wind moves through ancient cebas and the frogs call at dusk, you can still hear faint echoes of that first heartland. Not the roar of volcanoes or the crash of floods, but the steady murmur of people who learned to survive by transforming. They had outlasted the storm by becoming its song. When the last Olmec hands left their sacred island, they also left behind a map not drawn on bark or stone, but embedded in the very logic of how to build a world. The great civilizations that would rise after them, the Zapotecs of Monte Alban, the engineers of Teotihuacan, the astronomer kings of the Maya, were not copying ruins. They were inheriting ideas. The Olmecs had written the first draft of civilization in the Americas, and though time erased their names, their grammar endured in every city that followed. Their genius had been practical as much as spiritual. San Lorenzo and Venta were not just religious centers, they were laboratories of engineering. The Olmecs were the first to understand that power needed architecture, that belief required geometry. They learned to raise ground above floodwaters, to mold the earth into terraces, to shape canals that flowed like sentences through a paragraph of fields. Their clay cities taught later builders the principle that still defines Mesoamerican design: align the human with the cosmic. Centuries later, in the high valleys of Oaxaca, the Zapotecs would climb a mountain and flatten its top to build Monte Alban. Archaeologists marvel that its grand plaza sits perfectly along a north-south axis, its corners oriented to the stars, an echo of Venta's 8-degree westward tilt. The Olmecs had proven that the gods preferred order, and the Zapotecs built on that revelation. Their water channels and retaining walls repeated the lessons first tested in the wetlands: manage gravity, respect slope, let the landscape breathe. When Monte Alban's builders carved stone drainage systems that could survive centuries of rain, they were knowingly or not refining the equations invented by Olmec engineers of clay. Farther north, a miracle was unfolding on the high plains of central Mexico. Teotihuacan, the place of the gods, would rise where no river tamed the land, yet its planners followed invisible blueprints older than their city. The Avenue of the Dead stretched straight toward the mountains, lined with temples whose symmetry and orientation recall the ceremonial avenues of Venta. The Pyramid of the Sun, its bulk of adobe and stone, sits almost exactly where the sun sets on the same horizon, used by Olmec priests centuries earlier to mark planting seasons. Beneath its terraces ran drains and tunnels, the spiritual descendants of San Lorenzo's basalt channels. The Olmec idea that water was both technology and theology had become structural dogma. Even the grandest of Teotihuacan's innovations, its apartment compounds, carried Olmec DNA modular planning, communal courtyard symmetry that served both civic life and cosmic symbolism. The Olmecs had understood that a city's strength lay not just in walls, but in flow, the graceful movement of people, water, and ritual through the same arteries. Every later metropolis would echo that rhythm. In the lush jungles farther south, the Maya took this inheritance and elevated it into mathematics. Their cities, Palenque, Copan, Tikal, rose from forest floors in perfect geometric grids aligned to solstices and equinoxes. Their plazas mirrored Venta's rectangles. Their temples repeated its idea of height as holiness. The Olmecs had first raised the ground to reach the divine. The Maya turned that gesture into an art form. They built in stone what the Olmecs had imagined in clay. And beneath their artistry ran an agricultural system that still bore the Olmec fingerprint. The Chinampa, the raised field surrounded by water, may have been perfected later by the Aztecs, but its origin lay in the Olmec wetlands. Their farmers had long ago learned to float the soil to weave fertility out of flood. The same logic of cooperation with water, rather than conquest over it, fed the great cities that followed. In every maize stalk swaying above a canal in the Valley of Mexico, the ghost of an Olmec engineer was present. Urban planners of Teotihuacan, Zapotec masons at Monte Alban Maya, astronomers charting the heavens, all followed the same unseen instructions. Align sacred spaces to celestial rhythms. Balance terraces with the contours of the earth. Let water flow through, not around the heart of the city. Build not merely to endure time, but to express it. These were not coincidences. They were continuity. A civilization need not survive for its architecture to persist. The Olmecs had found the formula for harmony, and their descendants recited it in stone. Even in their myths, the pattern remained. The later peoples spoke of the first builders, those who tamed water and raised the mountains. The Aztecs called them Tamoanchan, the origin makers. In truth, they were remembering the Olmecs, though the name had been washed away by centuries of flood and silence. To the Zapotecs, the concept of divine kingship. To the Maya, the sacred calendar. To the Aztecs, the art of city as cosmos, all were ripples from that first experiment in order amid the mud. Stand today among the ruins of Teotihuacan or Monte Alban and close your eyes. You can almost hear the echo, the slosh of water through channels, the thud of feet on packed clay. the distant call of a conch shell greeting the dawn. The geometry is the same, the logic, the same humans aligning their fragile lives with the vast, indifferent precision of the universe. The Olmecs had done it first. They took the raw chaos of floodplain and carved it into meaning. They showed that cities could be instruments for prayer calendars. One could walk through mirrors reflecting both earth and sky. The civilizations that followed merely adjusted the pitch, but the melody was theirs. And so, even after the heartland was swallowed by jungle, its blueprint remained etched in the continent's imagination. Every stone temple, every step pyramid, every irrigation canal that traced the shape of a river was a footnote to an older text, one written not in ink, but in clay, in water, in faith. From the swamps of Veracruz to the high valleys of Oaxaca, from the jungles of Petén to the volcanic plains of Teotihuacan, the Olmecs lived on not as ghosts, but as geometry. Their true monument was never the colossal heads or buried altars. It was the enduring idea that civilization itself could be an act of harmony with the world. The later empires would rise and fall with swords and droughts, their temples crumble, their gods renamed. But the Olmec blueprint, that quiet marriage of engineering and reverence, would survive them all. It remains even now in every city, built to the compass, in every human effort to impose beauty on the chaos of nature. The first engineers of the New World had built not just for themselves, but for everyone who would come after. Their lines still guide us, invisible yet eternal, the first and greatest architecture, the geometry of belief. Long after the last Olmec altar sank beneath its own shadow, their gods kept breathing, changing shape, as time demanded, trading fur for feathers, claws for wings. The jungle that had once echoed with jaguar roars now murmured a different song, the hiss of the wind, the whisper of scales, the rustle of plumage. The Olmec pantheon, once carved in basalt and jade, had taken flight. To the Olmec's divinity was never still. Their gods were shapeshifters, jaguars that turned into men serpents that swam through clouds, babies born with fangs and feline eyes. They understood that the divine wasn't bound by form, that power was motion. When their cities fell and their language dissolved into others, their myths survived precisely because they could adapt. The jaguar would become the serpent, and the serpent, learning to fly, would conquer the sky. The Olmec rain god had always been an in-between creature, crocodile jaw, serpent body, human eyes that wept the monsoon. In later centuries, the Maya called him Chak, wielding thunder axes instead of claws, his tears the promise of rain. The Aztecs renamed him Tlaloc, the same face reborn with goggle eyes and fanged grin, his temples painted turquoise and white. But the root of the image water, as living predator storm, as breathing beast, was Olmec. Their priests had first listened to the rivers long enough to hear their voices. Other gods transformed more dramatically. Among the Olmecs, there had been stories of the sky serpent, a creature that coiled between the stars, bridging the realm of rain and fire. In Venta's reliefs, it slithered above kings and infants, its body looping like clouds. By the time the Maya rose, that serpent had grown feathers. They called him Kukulkan, the feathered serpent, the same cosmic mediator now radiant and refined. The Aztecs would inherit him as Quetzalcoatl, god of wind wisdom and rebirth. The jaguar had not died, it had learned to fly. The continuity is astonishing. The Olmecs saw their rulers as living bridges between worlds, half beast, half god. Later kings of the Maya and Aztec empires claimed the same right. When a Maya ruler donned a jaguar pelt and a Quetzal feather headdress, he was reenacting the oldest transformation in Mesoamerica, the union of predator and sky of earth's strength and heaven's vision. The Olmec myth of duality water and fire earth and sky man and beast became the very foundation of later theology. In their cosmology, nothing was lost, only reborn. You can trace the metamorphosis in stone. The fanged, downturned mouth of Olmec idols reappears on Maya temples, now framed by feathers and swirling clouds. The infant jaguar morphs into the smiling maize god of later ages, still with the same cleft head that once symbolized thunder. Even the Olmec obsession with mirrors, those polished discs of magnetite and pyrite, resurfaces in the myth of Quetzalcoatl, the lord of the shining mirror, who sees all creation reflected in his breastplate. The old symbols had simply shed their names and kept walking. It wasn't just imagery that endured, it was philosophy. The Olmecs had conceived the universe as fluid gods, rising and sinking like the tides, humans transforming through ritual and blood time looping instead of marching. The Maya would refine that vision into their calendar of endless cycles. The Aztecs would dramatize it in myths of suns born and destroyed. Beneath all of it lay an Olmec truth creation, his perpetual metamorphosis. To endure, you must change. The feathered serpent became the perfect emblem of that belief. In him, the Olmec reverence for the earthbound jaguar met the yearning for transcendence. He was contradiction made harmony scales for the soil feathers for the sky. His breath was wind, his tongue, lightning his coils the rivers. When he flew, he carried the memory of the jungle on his back. And wherever he flew over Monte Alban, over Teotihuacan, over Chichen Itza, the people built temples to greet him. At Teotihuacan, his cult reached architectural perfection. The temple of the feathered serpent, its facade lined with rows of stone serpents and seashells, embodied everything the Olmecs had whispered centuries before. The jaguar had given way to the serpent, but the message was the same divinity is the union of opposites. When the wind stirred the feathers carved in stone, it was as if the old god was breathing again. The Maya took the idea further. At Chichen Itza, the Great Pyramid of Kukulkan was engineered so that on the equinox, sunlight crawled down its staircase in the shape of a moving serpent. Crowds gasped as shadow and light performed the old transformation, the same story told by Olmec shamans around their fires followed 500 years earlier. In that golden shimmer, the jaguar's strength met the bird's grace, and the people believed time itself bowed in recognition. Even the Aztecs, in their final centuries before European conquest, spoke of Quetzalcoatl as a god who remembered. He was the bringer of knowledge, the teacher of agriculture, the one who gave humans maize echoes of the Olmec farmer priests who once read the rivers like scripture. In the Aztec myth, Quetzalcoatl departs eastward across the sea, promising to return. Some scholars see this as prophecy, others as nostalgia. But to the spirit of the Olmecs, it was only the continuation of an endless migration, the god's next transformation. Modern eyes see these parallels as coincidence or diffusion, but in truth, they are something rarer. The persistence of an idea so profound it could change shape for 3,000 years and never die. The Olmecs understood that the divine was not a statue, but a cycle that gods could molt like snakes and still remain themselves. Their faith was evolution disguised as worship. Every later culture merely added a new layer of feathers. When you stand today at Chichen Itza, during the equinox, watching that serpent of sunlight slide down the temple steps, it's easy to forget that its first breath was drawn in the swamps of Veracruz. The engineers of La Venta had once carved jaguars into clay. Now their descendants had turned light itself into a sculptor. The transformation was complete. The jungle's roar had become the whisper of wind across stone. The jaguar had not vanished. It had learned to soar. In every shining feather of the serpent god, you can still glimpse the shadow of the spotted cat crouching in the rain. The spirit of the Olmecs lived on, rising, gliding eternal, its body made of memory, its wings of myth. Civilizations often begin with walls and monuments, but the Olmecs built something far more enduring, a way of thinking. Long after their colossal heads were buried and their cities consumed by vines, the world they had known continued to turn by rhythms they had first measured. Their genius wasn't merely in clay and stone, it was in numbers cycles and the patient decoding of the sky. From mud and maize, they had distilled mathematics. The lowlands of Veracruz may seem an unlikely birthplace for science. The air there was thick with humidity, the horizon blurred by mist, the soil a restless mixture of flood and fertility. Yet it was precisely that instability that demanded order. The Olmecs could not rely on chance. They had to calculate. When would the rains return? When would the river swell? How could they predict the flood before it came? Observation became survival, and survival gave birth to intellect. At San Lorenzo, centuries before Euclid or Pythagoras Olmec, priests aligned plazas and temples with an uncanny precision. Their measurements were not random artistry. The main causeways ran along cardinal lines, while minor platforms deviated by predictable degrees to follow the sun's seasonal arcs. The city itself was a calendar, a physical equation carved into earth and basalt. At Venta, the same principle matured a central axis angled 8 degrees west of north, matching the solstitial path of the sun. When dawnlight struck the pyramid at specific points, it marked the changing seasons. The priests didn't simply worship the sun, they measured its reliability. These were not isolated coincidences. Excavations at later epi-Olmec sites, such as Tres Zapotes, have revealed alignments that functioned as observatories. Priests filled bowls with water to mirror the night sky, noting when Venus or the Pleiades shimmered at particular points on the horizon. Each year, the reflections repeated slow, patient lessons in cosmic regularity. Over generations, these observations evolved into a calendar system that would later blossom into the full mathematical brilliance of the Maya long count. The seed of that system was planted here in the swamps by people who understood that the heavens could be read like scripture. The Olmecs counted in 20s, the most natural system for a people who measured with fingers and toes. Their numerical signs, simple dots, and bars were the world's first steps toward abstraction on this continent. They invented the concept of zero long before the concept was named, leaving empty spaces to mark completed cycles. To them, zero was not nothingness, but rest. The pause between floods, the silence before dawn, the moment when creation inhaled. Each day, they measured not by clocks, but by movement, the shadow of a pillar, the sound of a drum, the distance a voice could travel before the air swallowed it. Their geometry was experiential, born from ritual, not calculation. When they measured time, they did not separate it from life. The calendar was an organism, the year a heartbeat. Their architecture reveals an intuitive grasp of proportion. The ratio of terrace to pyramid height, the spacing of plazas, the width of causeways, all fall within repeating patterns of scale. They built by rhythm, not ruler, yet the results are precise enough to rival modern surveyors. The same sense of pattern informed their art. A jade mask or a basalt relief carries the symmetry of a solved equation, left and right, in perfect balance chaos contained by curve. To carve such harmony from stone required not just artistry, but a mathematician's eye for equilibrium. Astronomy, mathematics, and religion were never separate disciplines to the Olmecs. They were three faces of the same pursuit, the search for balance. To know when the sun would rise was to honor the gods who made it rise. To measure the distance between stars was to glimpse the corridors of the divine. Every number was a prayer, every line a hymn. The priests who calculated the heavens did so, not from ivory towers, but from mud platforms surrounded by frogs and reeds. Science was born barefoot in the swamp. Even their myths encoded this mathematical worldview. The story of the feathered serpent, the god who bridged earth and sky, was also an allegory for proportion. The serpent's coils represented cycles of time, its feathers the motion of celestial bodies. When Olmec priests danced in spirals around the altars, they were tracing the orbits of planets, though they would have called it worship. To them, numbers were not inventions, they were revelations. The universe already counted, they merely learned to listen. The Olmec inscriptions of Tres Zapotec, carved centuries after the fall of Venta, preserve this legacy in stone. Their glyphs mark not stories of kings or wars, but dates. Each line of symbols is an attempt to fix time itself, to anchor the eternal, intangible form. The calendar round that would define the entire Mesoamerican world, the 260-day sacred cycle interwoven with the 365-day solar year, was already turning in those signs. From this arithmetic of divinity would grow the intricate Mayan long count, and eventually the astronomical precision that still startles modern scientists. But the Olmecs were not driven by conquest or curiosity alone. They measured because they cared. Their mathematics was compassionate at conversation with the elements, a means of harmonizing with forces beyond control. When they leveled terraces or aligned altars, they were aligning themselves with creation. Precision was piety. Their equations were acts of gratitude. If you stand in Venta today, amid the humid quiet and the cries of distant birds, the geometry still hums beneath your feet. The pyramid's slope catches the same angle of sunlight it did 25 centuries ago. The air still turns golden at the same moment each solstice, as if obeying a silent schedule written long before memory. The jungle hides the city, but not its pattern. The Olmecs designed in perpetuity. Their greatest invention then was not a monument or a god, but a way of seeing the world as measurable yet mystical, ordered yet alive. They proved that intellect and spirituality were not rivals but partners, that to count the stars was itself an act of reverence. The Maya and the Aztecs would later transform that insight into calendars and codices, but the foundation was laid by hands still slick with clay and river water. From mud to mathematics, from floodplain to firmament, the Olmecs taught Mesoamerica to think in rhythm with the cosmos. They found in the chaos of rain and soil a pattern in the pattern, a purpose, and in purpose the first glimmer of eternity. And though their voices have been silenced by time, their calculations remain etched in the movements of the heavens, whispered in the seasons, living proof that the universe once spoke in numbers, and the first people of the New World learned how to listen. For more than 2,000 years, the jungle had kept its secret. Beneath the palms and sugarcane fields of Veracruz, the world's first American civilization lay sleeping, its temples turned to mounds, its rivers rerouted its gods, silenced by vines. The locals sometimes found strange stones, while plowing faces peering from the mud, too large and calm to be human. They called them las cabezas grandes, the great heads, and moved on. The earth was thick with such mysteries. It would take the patient curiosity of modern science to make them speak again. The awakening came in fragments. In the early 20th century, explorers and archaeologists began to suspect that Mesoamerica's story did not begin with the Maya, but the proof arrived in 1938 when Matthew Stirling cut his way through the tropical brush at Tres Zapotes and La Venta. What he uncovered would rewrite history: colossal basalt heads with features so lifelike they seemed to breathe, jade mosaics buried with deliberate care, and platforms that revealed geometry so exact it could only be the work of a civilization, not chance. The Olmecs, long forgotten, unnamed for centuries, had returned. At first, the world struggled to understand what it was seeing. The colossal heads looked impossibly advanced, out of step with the assumed timeline of American prehistory. How could a people so ancient carve stone, so precisely align cities with the stars, shape jade with such tenderness? Some, unable to accept a native origin, proposed outlandish theories, lost Atlanteans, voyagers from Africa, even aliens. But careful excavation and radiocarbon dating soon told a simpler, truer story. The Olmecs had built this greatness themselves, long before the Maya raised a single pyramid. Mexico, it turned out, had always been the cradle of its own genius. As the decades passed, technology began to fill in the silences that time had left. Archaeologists cleared the encroaching jungle from La Venta, mapping the Great Clay Pyramid, the plazas, and the buried mosaics. LiDAR aerial laser scanning revealed entire landscapes invisible to the eye. Geometric platforms, causeways, and hidden mounds stretching for miles under forest canopy. What once seemed isolated discoveries became the interconnected remains of a vast and deliberate world. Hundreds of Olmec sites emerged, some small villages, others ceremonial centers, all aligned to celestial patterns. The precision was breathtaking. Even after 3 millennia, their cities still obeyed the sun. Then came El Manatí, a small swamp near the Tuxtla Mountains that stunned the modern world. There, archaeologists found wooden statues still intact after 3,000 years, the oldest in the Americas. They had been carefully placed in a natural spring, along with jade beads, rubber balls, and the bones of infants wrapped in cloth. The peat had preserved everything: the grain of the wood, the carved expressions, the fragments of reed mats. The statues' faces were serene, childlike, almost otherworldly. They were not idols, but offerings, proof that even at their dawn, the Olmecs treated water as holy. To hold one of those wooden figures today is to feel time breathing on your palm. Chemical analysis added further layers to their story. Scientists examined jade and obsidian artifacts, tracing their origins to distant mines hundreds of kilometers away. The Olmecs, it turned out, were the first to weave the trade web that later civilizations would expand, a network spanning mountains, coasts, and valleys. Their reach was continental. Even the basalt used for the colossal heads was proven to have been dragged from the Tuxtla volcanoes across miles of swamp, a feat of sheer will that modern engineers still marvel at. New techniques uncovered subtler details. Residue tests on ancient pots found traces of cacao, the earliest evidence of chocolate's ritual use. Pollen studies revealed crops of maize, squash, and chili pepper thriving in soil once thought too unstable for farming. DNA from human remains suggested that the Olmecs were not a lost race, but the ancestors of later Mesoamerican peoples. Far from being an isolated anomaly, they were the first verse in a long and beautiful poem. Today, drones map their cities from above, while ground-penetrating radar peers beneath the roots of ceiba trees to find forgotten plazas. Digital models recreate La Venta's pyramid, its red clay glistening under the sun as it did 2,500 years ago. In laboratories, scholars study the mineral fingerprints of jade beads, the isotopes of bones, the pigments of murals once buried in darkness. Piece by piece, the Olmecs are reassembling themselves not as myths, but as mathematicians, astronomers, and artists whose legacy quietly shaped half a continent. Yet the most profound rediscovery has been cultural, not scientific. Mexico has learned to see the Olmecs not as curiosities, but as ancestors. Their art now fills national museums. Their colossal heads, once half buried in sugar fields, stand in guarded reverence at Parque Museo La Venta in Villahermosa. Children wander between them, craning their necks to meet those calm stone eyes. Artists and poets find inspiration in their stillness. School books call them La Cultura Madre, the mother culture. Not because they ruled, but because they dreamed first. Even the people of Veracruz and Tabasco, descendants of many blended lineages, claim the Olmecs as kin. Festivals honor them with dances mimicking the jaguar and the serpent, the same spirits that once filled their ancestors' nights. The marshes they walked still glimmer under the same restless sky. In the rainy season, when thunder rolls and the rivers swell, locals say the old gods are waking, reminding the living that they never truly left. Standing before one of those colossal heads today is a strangely modern experience. You feel its gaze, unhurried, unjudging, as if it has already seen everything humanity could ever invent or destroy. Its basalt surface is smooth, where hands once touched it, its features softened by rain, but its expression remains unchanged, calm, enduring, alive. Archaeologists study it with scanners and lasers, but what it says can't be measured. It is a message across 3,000 years. Remember that we listened to the world before we tried to command it. The rediscovery of the Olmecs has become an act of reverence, not merely research. Every excavation reaffirms that science and spirit were never strangers in their world. Their canals were equations, their altars observatories, their offerings data points written in faith. To study them is to remember a time when knowledge and worship were the same motion, the hand raised to the sky, the eye turned toward the stars, the ear pressed to the earth. As technology illuminates more of their legacy, one truth grows brighter. We have not rediscovered the Olmecs. They have rediscovered us. Their cities were always there, waiting for the noise of history to quiet enough for us to hear their geometry again. In the soft light of a drone's camera or the cool glow of a museum gallery, their faces still look out with infinite patience, as if amused that we call them ancient, when in so many ways we are only now catching up. Part 25. What the Stone Still Remembers. Night settles over the old heartland. The air is thick again, sweet with earth, alive with the hum of unseen wings. Somewhere in the dark, a river moves, with the patience of centuries, its surface reflecting the same slow stars that once guided the builders of San Lorenzo. Time, that most ancient architect, continues its quiet work. The jungle sighs, and the stones, half buried and half awake, listen. The colossal heads lie where they were laid so long ago, serene, unhurried, immense. Rain beads on their cheeks, tracing the same grooves, carved by hands that believed they were sculpting eternity. To walk among them is to feel the border blur between past and present. You half expect them to blink, to turn their gaze toward the sound of your breath, but they do not move. They simply remember. What do they remember? Not the dates, not the dynasties. Stone keeps no calendar. It remembers in sensations, the weight of air before a storm, the taste of ash drifting from distant volcanoes, the rhythm of drums echoing through a wet night. It remembers the laughter of children chasing fireflies across a courtyard, the crackle of torches, the scent of cacao and clay. It remembers the touch of the sculptor's hand, the pressure of a thumb smoothing a lip, the sound of a chisel singing against basalt. It remembers, above all, that there were once people here who looked at the world and wanted to make it last. That, perhaps, is the most human instinct of all, the urge to leave a face in stone to outwit the flood. We carve not because we fear forgetting, but because we want the world to know we once listened. The Olmecs listened better than most. They heard the pulse in the rivers, the music in the rain, the whisper of cycles in the sky. When they set those sounds into stone, they were not preserving themselves. They were preserving a conversation. Each monument, each mask, each buried offering was a sentence in that dialogue between humanity and creation. Their language was material, clay basalt, jade waterlight. Their grammar was balance. And though the centuries have rewritten the words, the meaning remains. We were here, and we understood something beautiful. The archaeologists, the satellites, the LiDAR scans, these are only new ways of hearing the same old song. Every discovery is another verse returning to the surface. The heads rise from the ground like punctuation marks in the Earth's long story, reminding us that civilization began not with conquest, but with attention, with people who looked closely at the world and decided it was sacred. If you close your eyes now, you can almost feel it, the warm weight of humid air, the smell of rain-soaked soil, the distant rush of a river turning in its sleep. Somewhere, an ancient conch shell might be calling across the centuries, its note trembling just at the edge of hearing. And in that sound is everything: the laughter, the loss, the wisdom, the quiet. The Olmecs are gone, yet the world still carries their fingerprints. In the symmetry of cities, in the rhythm of calendars, in the soft curve of a potter's line, or the measured steps of an astronomer counting stars, they are present. The stone remembers, and through it, so do we. The last face, half buried in moss, stares toward the dawn. Light gathers slowly along its brow, and for an instant you can almost believe it breathes again. The world warms, the air stirs, and the first bird calls out over the endless green. Another day begins, just as it has for 3,000 years. The rivers dream on. The stones keep watch, and somewhere beneath all the noise of the living, the heart of the first civilization still beats steady, patient, eternal. Sleep well, traveler. The gods are still listening,